Hello everyone and welcome back. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you for all the support you've shown on the channel. It truly means a lot. If you enjoy these stories, please take a second to leave a like and subscribe. And don't forget to leave a comment below. I read them all, and your comment might be featured in the next video. Now let's begin. The forest doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. And sometimes when the moon hangs like a wound in the night sky and the wind carries whispers of things that should not be, the forest reveals its true nature. What you're about to read happened to me during my final weeks as a park ranger in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. I've written this account not as fiction, but as a warning. Some boundaries should never be crossed. Some territories belong to things older and hungrier than we can comprehend. The official report listed my resignation as medical leave due to psychological stress. The truth is far more terrifying. What I encountered in those ancient woods changed me forever, left scars that no medicine can heal. I see it in my dreams now, hear its voice in the rustling of leaves, feel its presence in every shadow. You may not believe what follows, but somewhere deep in the primal part of your brain that remembers when humans were prey, you'll recognize the truth. This is my story. This is my confession. This is my warning. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I saw, what I survived, and what's still out there waiting in the darkness between the trees. I'd been a ranger for 15 years when it began, long enough to know the difference between animal tracks and something else entirely. Long enough to recognize when the forest itself holds its breath in fear. It started with a silence. On a Tuesday morning in late September, I hiked the Whispering Creek Trail for my weekly patrol. The autumn air bit sharp against my face, carrying the scent of dying leaves and something else I couldn't identify, something metallic and wrong. The usual symphony of forest sounds had vanished. No bird song, no squirrel chatter, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the creek seemed to flow more quietly, as if afraid to make noise. I'd walked this trail hundreds of times, memorized every root and stone. But that morning, everything felt different. The shadows stretched longer despite the morning sun. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a canopy that blocked more light than it should. And the smell, that metallic wrongness, grew stronger with each step. 3 miles in, I found the first sign. A deer carcass hung 20 feet up in an old-growth fir wedged between 2 massive branches. No predator I knew could carry a full-grown buck that high. The body showed no bite marks, no claw wounds. Instead, the hide had been peeled away in perfect strips, like someone had carefully unwrapped a gift. The meat beneath remained untouched, already bloated with decay. I radioed headquarters, reported the unusual find. Sarah Chen, our district supervisor, suggested a bear had cached its kill, despite my protest that bears don't skin their prey with surgical precision. She promised to send the wildlife biologist out to investigate, but I knew Maxwell Rodriguez wouldn't find anything that would satisfy the growing dread in my gut. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my cabin's old timbers sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind through the pines whispered my name. I found myself checking the locks on my doors and windows, something I'd never done in all my years living alone in the forest. When exhaustion finally claimed me near dawn, my dreams filled with images of something watching from the tree line, something that wore the shapes of familiar things but wasn't quite right. The second sign came 3 days later. I was checking the bear-proof garbage containers near the Cascade Vista campground when I noticed the tracks. They started human, the clear impression of a hiking boot in the soft earth beside the restrooms, but as I followed them into the tree line, they changed. The heel elongated. The toe marks stretched and separated, becoming something more like claws. By the time the tracks disappeared into a patch of granite bedrock, they looked more animal than human, though no animal I could identify. The tracks measured nearly 18 inches long. I took photographs, made plaster casts, documented everything with the methodical precision of my training. But my hands shook as I worked, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder at the dark spaces between the trees. Something was watching me. I could feel its attention like a weight on my shoulders, could sense its hunger even though I couldn't see it. The biologist examined my evidence with skeptical interest. Maxwell had worked in these mountains for 20 years, seen everything from mutant raccoons to albino bears, but even he couldn't explain the tracks. His official report described them as unusual formations possibly created by natural erosion and pareidolia, seeing patterns where none existed. In private, he admitted the casts made his skin crawl. Whatever made these, he told me over coffee at the ranger station. It's big, and it's smart enough to avoid the trail cameras. That was the problem. We'd installed motion-activated cameras throughout the sector after reports of missing hikers began filtering in from neighboring districts. Every camera captured the same thing. Normal forest activity until exactly 3:17 a.m. each night when they went dark for precisely 47 minutes. When they resumed recording, we'd find new evidence of the thing's presence. Broken branches, scattered fur from various animals, and always those impossible tracks leading to and from the dead zones. The missing persons reports started accumulating on my desk like autumn leaves. Vincent Hayes, a solo backpacker who'd checked in at the Pine Ridge trailhead and never returned. Tyler Morrison, an experienced hiker whose abandoned campsite showed signs of a struggle but no blood, no body. Caroline Pierce, a nature photographer whose camera we found smashed against a tree trunk, the memory card corrupted beyond recovery. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Experienced outdoors people. Solo travelers. Last seen heading into the deepest parts of the forest where cell service died and the old trees grew close enough to block the sun. Search parties found minimal evidence, scattered gear, cold campsites, and those impossible tracks that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. I started volunteering for every search mission, driven by a need to understand what was happening in my forest. During one search for Austin Blake, a missing rock climber, we found something that changed everything. Hidden in a grove of ancient cedars, 20 feet off any established trail, lay a clearing I'd never seen before despite patrolling this area for years. The ground had been scraped clear of vegetation, forming a perfect circle 30 feet across. In the center sat a pile of bones, animal and otherwise, arranged with deliberate care. The bones showed no teeth marks, no signs of scavenging. They'd been cracked open and the marrow extracted with surgical precision. Worse than the bones were the pieces of fabric scattered throughout the clearing, scraps of modern hiking gear and camping equipment that matched the descriptions of items belonging to our missing persons. But it was what we found at the edge of the clearing that made my blood run cold. Skin, human skin, tanned and preserved like leather, stretched between two trees as if hung out to dry. The pieces varied in size and color, suggesting multiple sources. Some still bore the faded traces of tattoos, others showed tan lines from clothing and jewelry. All had been removed with expert precision, the edges clean and even as if cut by someone with extensive anatomical knowledge. I wanted to call in the FBI, declare the area a crime scene, bring in every resource we had to hunt down whatever monster was responsible. But when I returned with the forensics team the next morning, the clearing was gone. Not abandoned, gone. Where the circle of bones and horrific trophies had been, we found only normal forest floor, undisturbed leaf litter, and healthy undergrowth that looked decades old. Even the GPS coordinates I'd carefully marked led us to nothing but empty woods. The other search team members looked at me with growing concern as I insisted we were in the right location, as I pointed to where I'd seen horrors that no longer existed. My reputation for reliability, built over 15 years of faithful service, crumbled in a single morning. Sarah Chen suggested I take some time off, get some rest, maybe talk to someone about the stress of so many missing persons cases, but I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it was still out there. That night, alone in my cabin as rain drummed against the windows, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I would find the truth, whatever it cost me. I would track this thing through the deepest parts of the forest, follow it to its lair, and end the nightmare that had consumed my world. I had no idea that the nightmare was just beginning. The old-growth section of the Cascade Wilderness stretched for over 50 square miles of roadless, trail-free forest where the trees grew so thick that GPS signals died and compasses spun like confused dancers. It was the kind of place that swallowed hikers whole, where search and rescue teams feared to venture even in daylight. And it was exactly where the tracks always led before disappearing into the granite and shadow. I'd been planning this expedition for 2 weeks, gathering supplies and studying topographical maps by lamplight in my cabin. Official channels had failed me. The thing, whatever it was, had made a mockery of our standard procedures, vanishing evidence and evading our cameras with an intelligence that chilled me to the bone. If I was going to find answers, I'd have to venture beyond the mapped world, into the spaces between the lines where monsters might hide. My pack contained enough supplies for 5 days: freeze-dried rations, a water purification system, medical supplies, emergency shelter, and enough batteries to keep my equipment running. I'd also packed items not found in any ranger manual: a modified trail camera with military-grade night vision, motion sensors borrowed from a friend in private security, and a .45 caliber pistol that Sarah Chen would have my badge for if she knew about it. I left before dawn on a Friday, telling Sarah I was taking a mental health day in Seattle. Instead, I drove to the most remote access point in our district, a forgotten logging road that petered out into deer paths and bear trails. From there, I would hike into the heart of the deep forest, following the patterns I'd observed in the missing persons cases and the scattered evidence we'd found. The morning mist clung to the forest floor as I began my descent into the valley. Ancient cedars and Douglas firs towered overhead, their trunks thick enough to hide a school bus. The canopy blocked so much light that my flashlight remained necessary even at midday. Everything about this place felt old. Not just the trees, but the very air itself, heavy with the weight of centuries. 3 hours in, I found the first indication I was on the right track. Scattered along a game trail were bones, small ones at first. Squirrels, rabbits, songbirds, all showed the same precise processing I'd seen before. Marrow extracted, meat consumed, hide removed with surgical care. The bones had been arranged in small piles, as if someone was collecting them for a specific purpose. The trail of bone piles led deeper into the valley, away from any human habitation or established path. I followed them like breadcrumbs, documenting each find with my camera and GPS unit. The forest around me grew quieter with each mile, until the only sounds were my own breathing and the soft crunch of pine needles under my boots. By late afternoon, I'd descended nearly 2,000 feet into a valley that didn't appear on any map. The trees here were different, older, stranger, twisted into shapes that suggested they'd grown in response to something other than sunlight. Spanish moss hung from their branches despite being thousands of miles from its natural habitat. The very air smelled different, carrying scents of decay and something else, something alive and hungry. I made camp in a small clearing beside a stream that ran black despite its clear water. As I set up my tent, I placed the motion sensors in a perimeter around my campsite, each one equipped with silent alerts that would vibrate a receiver on my wrist. If anything larger than a chipmunk moved within 50 yards of my position, I'd know about it. The modified trail camera went on a tree 20 yards away, positioned to capture the entire clearing with its enhanced night vision. If the thing came for me, at least there would be evidence of what happened. Maybe the next person foolish enough to venture into these woods would find my camera and learn from my mistakes. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. I huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to sounds that had no place in any normal forest. Branches breaking in patterns too rhythmic to be natural. Something large moving through the underbrush with deliberate care, circling my camp just beyond the range of my sensors. And underneath it all, a sound that made my skin crawl, a low humming, almost like singing, in a voice that seemed to shift between human and something else entirely. At 3:17 a.m., my motion sensors went silent. I woke to find my wrist receiver dark, its LED display blank despite the fresh batteries I'd installed that morning. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no water, no insects. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened around me. Through the mesh window of my tent, I saw a shadow moving between the trees. It walked upright like a human, but moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Its limbs seemed too long, its proportions wrong in ways my brain struggled to process. What I first took for clothing resolved into something far worse as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. The thing wore skin like garments, patches of different colors and textures stitched together with what looked like sinew. Some pieces still bore hair or fur, creating a macabre patchwork that shifted and rippled with each movement. The creature paused at the edge of my clearing, close enough that I could see its face in the starlight filtering through the canopy. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. It had no face of its own. Instead, stretched across the front of its skull was a mask of human skin, the features expertly preserved but wrong, too wide for the underlying bone structure, the eyes misaligned, the mouth hanging slack like an empty sleeve. Below it, more faces were layered and stitched, creating a horrible collection of expressions frozen in death. But the eyes, the thing's real eyes, gleamed from the darkness beneath the mask. They were intelligent, calculating, and utterly without mercy. They were the eyes of something that had been human once, long ago, before it chose to become something else entirely. The skin mutant tilted its head, studying my tent with the patience of a practiced hunter. When it opened its mouth, the borrowed face stretched and distorted, revealing rows of filed teeth behind lips that would never again speak words of love or comfort. The humming sound I'd heard earlier emerged from deep in its throat, a lullaby written in frequencies that made my bones ache. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, barely daring to breathe as the thing circled my campsite. It moved with supernatural quiet, its footsteps making no sound on the forest floor despite its obvious size. When it passed directly in front of my tent, I caught its scent, the metallic wrongness I'd detected on that first morning, mixed with the smell of poorly cured leather and something else that made my stomach revolt. It was the smell of someone who had worn too many skins that weren't their own. The creature completed its circuit of my camp and melted back into the forest as silently as it had come. Only when the normal sounds of night began to return did I dare to move, checking the luminous dial of my watch to find that 47 minutes had passed. Exactly the same duration as the dead zones on our security cameras. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Dawn brought no relief. My motion sensors remained dead, their electronics apparently fried by whatever had passed through the clearing. The trail camera was gone entirely, its mounting bracket empty, and the tree showing fresh scratches where something had climbed to retrieve it. Even the stream seemed to run darker than before, carrying the scent of decay downstream to whatever waited in the deeper parts of the valley. But it had left me something in return. Hanging from a branch directly over my tent was a piece of skin, human skin, tanned and prepared with the same care I'd seen in the hidden clearing. This one was different, though. This one bore a familiar tattoo, an eagle and anchor that I recognized from the missing person report for Justin Rivera, a former Marine who disappeared 6 weeks earlier. The message was clear. The thing knew I was hunting it, and now it was hunting me. I broke camp quickly, stuffing my gear into my pack with shaking hands. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound carried the threat of discovery. The smart thing would have been to retreat, to hike back to civilization and find a new career in a place where the worst predators were other humans. But Justin Rivera deserved better than to become part of a monster's wardrobe. They all did. I pushed deeper into the valley, following a stream that led toward the heart of the wilderness. The bone piles grew larger and more frequent, graduating from small forest animals to deer, elk, and other bones I couldn't identify. The trees grew stranger too, their bark scarred with claw marks and strange symbols that looked almost like writing. Spanish moss draped everything in funeral shrouds, creating a cathedral of the damned where something wearing the faces of the dead conducted its unholy services. By midday, I reached the place where the stream disappeared into a cave system carved into the living rock of the mountain. The entrance yawned 40 feet wide and 20 feet tall, its depths black as original sin. The smell that emerged from its depths made the metallic wrongness seem pleasant by comparison. It was the smell of a charnel house, of bodies left to rot in airless spaces where sunlight never reached. Standing at the cave mouth, I found the final proof of what I was dealing with. Stretched between two stone pillars like macabre curtains were skins, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, human skins of every age and description, expertly preserved and displayed like trophies. They moved in the slight breeze from the cave, creating a grotesque ballet of the dead that made my vision swim with horror. But it was what I found carved into the stone above the entrance that made me understand the true scope of the nightmare I'd stumbled into. In letters 3 feet tall, burned into the living rock with acids that had stained the stone black, someone had written a single word in a language I didn't recognize but understood with primal terror: Skinwalker. This wasn't just a monster hiding in the forest. This was something with history, something with tradition, something that had been perfecting its craft for longer than our civilization had existed, and somewhere in the darkness beyond those hanging skins it waited for me to join its collection. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and never look back. But as I stood at the threshold of hell, I thought about all the missing people, all the families waiting for answers that would never come. Someone had to bear witness. Someone had to survive long enough to tell the truth. I checked my pistol, said a prayer to whatever gods might still watch over fools and heroes, and stepped into the darkness. The cave entrance swallowed me like the throat of some primordial beast. My flashlight beam penetrated only a few feet into the darkness before being absorbed by shadows that seemed to have weight and substance. The hanging skins brushed against my shoulders as I passed, their leathery touch leaving trails of cold that penetrated to my bones. Each one told a story of terror and loss, of final moments when someone realized they would never see home again. The cave system extended far deeper than any natural formation should have, tunnels branching off in directions that defied the mountain's known geology. The walls showed tool marks, evidence of deliberate excavation and expansion. Someone had been working these caves for decades, maybe centuries, carving out chambers and passages for purposes I was only beginning to understand. 20 feet inside, I found the first workshop. The chamber opened to my left, roughly circular and 30 feet across. The walls were lined with wooden frames where skins hung in various stages of preparation. Some still dripped with the chemicals used in the tanning process, filling the air with acrid fumes that burned my throat and eyes. Others had been expertly sewn together into larger pieces, coats, robes, and other garments that suggested their wearer had moved beyond mere collection to active use. Along one wall, crude shelves held an assortment of tools that belonged in a taxidermist's nightmare. Flensing knives with handles worn smooth by decades of use, needles and thread for joining pieces, bottles containing chemicals and preservatives, their labels written in that same unknown script I'd seen at the cave entrance. And in the center of it all, a workbench stained black with substances I didn't want to identify, but it was the journal lying open on the bench that stopped me cold. The pages were filled with meticulous notes written in English in a careful hand that spoke of education and intelligence. Dates going back 40 years, detailed descriptions of techniques for skin removal and preservation, maps of the surrounding forest marking hunting grounds and safe paths, and scattered throughout, sketches of the thing I'd seen in my camp, or rather what it had been before it began its transformation. The early entries read like the diary of a park ranger not unlike myself. Someone who loved the forest and wanted to protect it from encroachment. Someone who'd discovered something in these caves and made a choice that damned him forever. June 15, 1983, found the old ceremonial site today. The symbols matched the descriptions in grandfather's stories, the ones he swore were just legends. But the power here is real. I can feel it in the stones, in the air itself. Something waits in the deep caves, something that remembers the old ways. June 20, 1983, made contact. It spoke to me in dreams, showed me visions of what I could become. The rangers want to close this section of forest to development. They don't understand that some places are already owned. Some places have guardians. July 4th, 1983, first transformation. The pain is incredible, but so is the clarity that follows. I can see in the dark now, hear heartbeats from a mile away. The old boundaries don't apply anymore. I am becoming something more than human. July 15, 1983, need to feed. The hunger is constant now, demanding more than animal flesh can provide. The hikers come so willingly into my domain. They never expect the ranger to be their predator. The entries continued for years, documenting a slow descent into monstrosity. The writer described each kill with clinical precision, noting which skins preserved best and which techniques produced the finest results. He wrote about wearing the faces of his victims to lure others, about the intoxicating feeling of literally walking in another person's skin. The final entries spoke of something beyond mere murder and mutilation. October 31st, 1995, the great work is nearly complete. 47 confirmed kills, each one chosen for specific qualities. Soon I will have enough material to perform the final binding. The cave spirits grow restless with anticipation. November 15th, 1995, something went wrong. The binding requires a willing sacrifice, someone who understands the true nature of power. The unwilling dead cannot complete the transformation. I must find one who will choose to join me in immortality. The final entry was dated just 3 days ago. September 20th, 2023, he has come at last. The one whose scent carries the same understanding, the same protective hunger. I have watched him search, seen him document my work with the reverence of a true student. Soon he will stand where I stand now, reading my words, Soon he will understand that some guardians are chosen by the forest itself. My blood turned to ice water as I read my own fate written in a dead man's hand. This wasn't random predation or simple madness. This was recruitment. The thing had been studying me, learning my patterns, drawing me deeper into its web with the patience of something that had waited decades for the right candidate. A sound echoed from the deeper caves. The same humming I'd heard in my camp, but louder now, more confident. It knew I'd found the journal. It knew I understood. The pretense of hunting was over. Now came the real test. I drew my pistol and continued deeper into the complex, following the sound through passages that grew progressively stranger. The walls here showed evidence of different construction techniques, older methods using stone tools and primitive cement. Some sections had been carved by human hands, but others showed the tooth marks of something else entirely. Something with jaws capable of chewing through solid rock. The tunnels branched and rejoined in patterns that made no geometric sense. I tried to maintain my sense of direction, but the compass spun wildly and my GPS unit showed nothing but static. The cave system existed in its own space, governed by rules that had nothing to do with normal geography. I passed more workshops, each one specializing in different aspects of the craft. One chamber contained rows of metal hooks where fresh kills hung like sides of beef in a butcher shop. Another held soaking vats filled with chemicals that preserved tissue while maintaining flexibility. A third was dedicated to needlework, with sewing machines both modern and antique arranged around partially completed garments that would have made a medieval torturer jealous. But it was the gallery that nearly broke my sanity. The chamber stretched over 100 feet in every direction, its walls covered floor to ceiling with mounted displays. Each one showed a different victim, their skin carefully preserved and arranged to suggest the living person. Nameplates provided dates and brief descriptions. Vincent Hayes, solo hiker, September 2023. Caroline Pierce, nature photographer, August 2023. Names from my missing persons files stared back at me with empty eye sockets, their final moments preserved for eternity. At the center of the gallery stood a mannequin wearing the most elaborate creation yet. A full-body suit made from dozens of different skins, each piece chosen for specific qualities and stitched together with surgical precision. The face was a composite of 3 different people, their features blended into something that looked almost normal until you noticed the seams. It wore the badge and uniform of a park ranger, the fabric stained with substances that had once been human. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice came from directly behind me, impossibly close considering I'd heard no footsteps. I spun around to find the thing standing just outside my flashlight beam. Its current face split in a smile that showed rows of filed teeth. Up close, I could see the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. The creature wore a coat made from at least 20 different skins, each one perfectly preserved and tailored to fit its elongated frame. The face it currently displayed had once belonged to a young woman, probably a hiker who'd trusted the wrong guide. Her features had been stretched and modified to fit over the thing's inhuman skull, creating an effect that was both beautiful and utterly wrong. 47 years I've worked to perfect the art, it continued, its voice a horrible mixture of human speech and something else. 47 lives given to preserve beauty forever. But something was always missing, the willing participant, the true partner in creation. It gestured toward the mannequin with one clawed hand. This was meant to be your uniform, your contribution to the great work. But I've been watching you, studying your methods. You understand preservation. You understand the sacred duty of protecting the wild places from those who would destroy them. The thing began to circle me, moving with fluid grace despite its impossible proportions. They come here thinking they own the forest, thinking they can take whatever they want, leave whatever they please. But we know better, don't we? We understand that some things must be preserved exactly as they are, no matter the cost. I tried to track its movement with my weapon, but it stayed just outside the flashlight's range. A shadow given substance and malevolent will. You've seen my work. You've studied it with the dedication of a true craftsman. Join me, and I'll teach you secrets that no textbook contains. Together we can ensure that this forest remains pure forever. You're insane, I managed to whisper, though my voice carried no conviction. Part of me, a part I tried desperately to suppress, understood what it was offering. Eternal purpose, the power to truly protect the wilderness I loved. And all it would cost was my humanity. The creature laughed, A sound like wind through a graveyard. Sanity is a luxury for those who don't understand the true nature of existence. Look around you. 47 perfect preservations. 47 souls saved from the corruption of civilization. Their beauty will last forever, untouched by time or decay. It stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell the chemicals and decay that clung to its patchwork form. I was like you once, a guardian of these mountains. But guardianship requires sacrifice, the willingness to become something more than human when humanity isn't enough. The thing reached toward me with one elongated hand, its fingers ending in claws that could strip flesh from bone with surgical precision. Feel the power in this place? Feel the weight of centuries, the accumulated wisdom of those who came before. This cave system is older than your civilization. The native peoples knew its purpose. They fed it willing offerings to keep the darkness contained, but the old ways were forgotten. The offerings stopped. So the darkness found new forms, new purposes. I became its agent, its hands in the modern world. But I'm old now, tired. The great work needs fresh blood, fresh vision. My pistol felt heavy in my hand, inadequate against something that had already died decades ago and been reborn as something else. But I had to try. For all the missing people, for all the families still waiting for answers, I had to find a way to end this nightmare. What makes you think I'd ever join you? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. The creature's borrowed face split in a grin that revealed far too many teeth. Because you're already changing. Did you think exposure to this place would leave you unmarked? The caves are alive, breathing, watching. They've been testing you since the moment you stepped inside. It was then that I noticed the changes. My vision had grown sharper, able to pick out details in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. My hearing had become acute enough to detect the creature's heartbeat, assuming it still had one, and the hunger, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of food would satisfy. The transformation has already begun, the thing whispered. Fight it and you'll die as just another failed candidate. Embrace it and you'll become something magnificent. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. The caves grow impatient. As if summoned by its words, I felt movement in the darkness around us. Other things stirring in the depths. Things that had been human once but had made different choices when faced with the same decision. The failed candidates. The ones who'd refused the offer and been consumed anyway. I raised my pistol, knowing it was probably useless but needing to make some gesture of defiance. I choose to remain human, the creature sighed, a sound like wind through autumn leaves. I had hoped for better from you, but perhaps you're not ready to see the truth. Perhaps you need more time to consider the alternatives. It gestured toward the shadows with one clawed hand, and I heard them beginning to move. Dozens of shapes detaching themselves from the cave walls, shambling forward with the jerky movements of marionettes controlled by an inexpert hand. The failed candidates transformed into something neither human nor monster but caught forever between the two states. They'll keep you company while you think, the creature said, already beginning to fade back into the darkness. When you're ready to join me willingly, simply call my name. I'll be waiting in the deep places, preparing for the day when you finally understand that preservation requires sacrifice. As its voice echoed away into the tunnels, the shambling things emerged into my flashlight beam. I saw faces I recognized from missing person reports, twisted and wrong but still identifiable. They moved with hungry purpose, reaching toward me with fingers that ended in broken nails and exposed bone. I ran. Behind me, the failed candidates gave chase through passages that seemed to shift and change with each turn. My enhanced senses showed me paths invisible to normal human perception, routes through the cave system that shouldn't have existed but provided escape from the shuffling horrors. The creature's gift, helping me survive long enough to make the choice it wanted. I ran through galleries of preserved victims, past workshops where unspeakable crafts were practiced, through chambers carved from living rock by things that had never been entirely human. The caves went deeper than any mountain should contain, extending into spaces where geometry became flexible and distance lost all meaning. Finally, impossibly, I saw light ahead. Real sunlight filtered through hanging skins, but genuine nonetheless. I burst from the cave entrance into the fading afternoon, gasping air that tasted clean despite the metallic tang that seemed permanently lodged in my throat. But as I looked back at the cave mouth, I knew this wasn't an escape. It was a reprieve. The thing had let me go, confident that I would return when the changes it had started became too much to bear alone. It had marked me, claimed me, begun a transformation that could only be completed one of two ways. I could return willingly and join its immortal craft, or I could fight the changes until they destroyed me, becoming just another failed candidate shambling through the darkness. Either way, I was no longer fully human. The forest had claimed me just as surely as it had claimed the ranger whose journal I'd read. The only question now was whether I would have any choice in what I became. I stumbled through the forest for hours, crashing through underbrush and scrambling over fallen logs in my desperate flight from the cave. The sun had set by the time I reached my abandoned campsite, and the enhanced night vision that had helped me navigate the tunnels now showed me every shadow, every movement in perfect, terrifying detail. The forest was alive with things that should have remained hidden, creatures that fled from my altered scent as if I carried some invisible mark of predation. My reflection in the stream's dark water confirmed my worst fears. My pupils had dilated to capture every photon of available light, giving my eyes an inhuman gleam. My fingernails had grown longer and harder, developing points sharp enough to score bark from trees. Most disturbing of all, my skin had begun to loosen in places as if preparing for something that wanted to wear it differently. The transformation was accelerating. I tried to radio headquarters, desperate to report what I'd found and warn others away from the cave system. But my radio produced only static, the same electronic interference that had plagued our equipment throughout the disappearances. The thing, the original ranger who'd become something else, had planned for this. It wanted me isolated, cut off from help, forced to face the changes alone. By dawn, I'd made it back to the logging road where I'd left my vehicle. The drive to town passed in a haze of superhuman perception and growing hunger. Every small animal that crossed the road triggered predatory instincts I'd never experienced. The smell of other humans made my mouth water in ways that horrified me. Whatever the creature had done to me in that cave was rewriting fundamental parts of my biology, but I still had enough humanity left to fight it. I had to warn people, had to find a way to stop the nightmare before it spread beyond the forest. The thing had been content to hunt solo hikers and campers for decades, but its talk of a great work suggested bigger plans. Plans that might require more than one guardian to implement. I drove straight to the ranger station, ignoring the concerned looks from my colleagues as I burst through the door with wild hair and clothes torn by my flight through the woods. Sarah Chen took one look at me and immediately called for medical attention, assuming I'd had some kind of breakdown in the wilderness. I tried to explain about the cave, about the skin-wearing creature and its gallery of victims, but my words came out in a rushed babble that sounded insane even to my own ears. They sedated me before I could finish my report. I woke up in the county hospital, strapped to a bed with thick leather restraints. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about psychological breaks, about the stress of too many missing persons cases finally overwhelming a dedicated ranger's mind. They showed me the photos I'd taken, empty forest scenes with no trace of the bone piles and tracks I'd documented so carefully. My plaster casts had crumbled to dust during the night, leaving no evidence of the impossible footprints, but the creature's changes to my body were progressing faster than its ability to erase evidence. My fingernails continued to grow despite the staff trimming them twice daily. My skin grew looser and more flexible, taking on a waxy quality that reminded me of poorly preserved leather. And the hunger, the terrible gnawing hunger for something no hospital cafeteria could provide, grew stronger with each passing hour. On the third night, I managed to slip my restraints. The transformation had given me more than enhanced senses and predatory instincts. My joints had become unnaturally flexible, allowing me to dislocate bones and compress my frame in ways that would have been impossible for a normal human. I flowed out of the restraints like liquid, reformed my shoulders with barely a sound, and padded barefoot through the darkened hospital corridors. Every patient I passed smelled like potential prey. The nurses and security guards carried scents that spoke of fear and vulnerability, triggering responses I struggled to control. Part of me wanted to return to my bed, to accept the doctor's explanations and let them treat my breakdown with medication and therapy, but a larger part recognized that path led only to destruction. Either the consumption of innocent people or my own transformation into another failed candidate shambling through cave tunnels. I had to return to the forest, I had to face the thing that had marked me and find a way to break its hold before I became something that threatened everyone I'd sworn to protect. I stole clothes from the hospital laundry, supplies from the emergency room, and a vehicle from the parking garage. By sunrise, I was back in the wilderness, following logging roads toward the deep valleys where nightmare waited patiently for my return. But this time, I wasn't going as a naive investigator stumbling into a trap. I was going as a hunter, armed with knowledge of my enemy and acceptance of what I might have to sacrifice to stop it. The creature had made one critical mistake in its confidence. It had shared too much, revealed too much about its methods and history. The journal entries had mentioned native ceremonies, old ways of containing the darkness that lived in these mountains. If the original inhabitants had found methods to control or appease the thing, perhaps those methods could be rediscovered and used. I spent 2 days researching in the county library, poring over historical accounts and anthropological studies of the regional tribes. Most of the records had been sanitized by well-meaning academics, but fragments of the old stories remained. References to a hunger that walks in borrowed skin, descriptions of ceremonial sites where offerings were made to keep ancient evils contained, and most importantly, accounts of warrior societies tasked with hunting things that preyed on human settlements. The key lay in understanding what the creature really was. Not just a mad ranger who'd undergone some impossible transformation, but something far older that had learned to use human form as a tool. The cave system predated any known settlement, carved by generations of something that had perfected the art of wearing human skin like clothing. The ranger had simply been its latest recruit, chosen for his knowledge of the modern forest and ability to lure victims into the deep places. But if the stories were accurate, the creature had weaknesses. Specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood its true nature. Iron weapons blessed with certain rituals. Fire created from wood taken from trees struck by lightning. And most importantly, the willing sacrifice of someone who'd been partially transformed but retained enough humanity to choose death over corruption. The research painted a clear picture of what I would have to do. Return to the cave, find the creature's true lair in the deepest chambers, and destroy it using methods passed down through generations of people who'd faced similar horrors. The fact that I was already changing might actually be an advantage. I could navigate its domain with enhanced senses while still possessing enough human will to resist its final offers. I spent the 3rd day gathering supplies. A knife forged from meteoric iron purchased from a collector who thought I was building a fantasy weapon. Wood from an oak tree that showed clear signs of lightning strikes carefully carved into stakes and arrows. Salt from ancient seabeds known to disrupt the spiritual energies that allowed such creatures to maintain their unnatural existence. And finally, a small vial of my own blood, drawn before the transformation could progress any further. As the sun set on my 4th day of preparation, I felt the creature's influence pulling me back toward the mountains. The changes to my body had accelerated during my absence, as if proximity to the cave system somehow slowed the process. My skin hung loose in places, ready to be shed like a snake's scales. My teeth had grown sharper, better suited for rending flesh than consuming normal food. And the hunger had become a constant ache that made concentration nearly impossible. Time was running out. If I waited much longer, I would lose the ability to choose my own fate. The transformation would complete itself, and I would join the ranks of failed candidates or willing servants depending on how much humanity remained. Either way, the people I'd sworn to protect would face a new threat, one that knew all their weaknesses and hiding places. I drove back to the abandoned logging road as darkness fell, my enhanced vision turning the forest into a landscape of silver shadows and black depths. Every tree seemed to lean inward, creating paths that led inevitably toward the cave system. Every sound carried the promise of violence and consumption. The forest itself had become complicit in the creature's hunt, reshaped by decades of unnatural predation into something that served its appetites. But I was no longer the same person who'd first stumbled onto this nightmare. The changes that horrified me also provided advantages the creature might not expect. I could see in perfect darkness, move with inhuman silence, and sense the emotional states of other living things. If I could resist the final stages of transformation long enough, I might be able to use its own gifts against it. The hike to the cave took half the time it had before, my altered physiology allowing me to navigate terrain that would have challenged an experienced mountaineer. I felt the creature's awareness touch my mind as I approached, its satisfaction at my return mixed with curiosity about the supplies I carried. It knew I'd come armed with more than conventional weapons, but its confidence remained unshaken. How many others had tried similar approaches over the decades? How many had failed in the final moments when faced with the choice between transformation and destruction? The cave entrance loomed before me, its hanging curtain of preserved skins stirring in a breeze that carried the scent of ancient death. My enhanced senses showed me details I'd missed during my first visit. Symbols carved into the stone that matched descriptions from the historical accounts, worn smooth by centuries of ritual use. This place had been a site of power long before the first ranger discovered it. A threshold between the human world and something far older and hungrier. I lit a torch made from lightning-struck oak, its flame burning with unnatural intensity in the cave's stagnant air. The preserved skins recoiled from the light as if they retained some memory of living flesh. Good. The old method still held power in this place where the normal laws of reality had been bent to serve inhuman appetites. "I've returned," I called into the darkness, my voice echoing through passages that seemed to stretch far beyond the mountain's physical boundaries. But not as you expected. The creature's laughter drifted from the depths, amused and confident. "I smell the iron you carry, the blessed flame you've kindled. Do you think the old superstitions will save you? This place has consumed warrior priests and monster hunters for longer than your people have walked upright. Their bones line the deepest chambers, their skins hang with all the others." "Maybe," I replied, starting into the tunnels with my torch held high. "But they didn't have what I have. They didn't understand what you really are." The creature's amusement faded slightly. "And what am I, little guardian? What do you think you've learned in your brief time among the civilized?" I passed the first workshop, noting how the preserved skins writhed away from my torch as if in pain. The blessed fire was already affecting the creature's domain, disrupting the unnatural preservation that maintained its collections. "You're not some ancient evil or prehistoric monster. You're a parasite, a spiritual infection that spreads from host to host, growing stronger with each generation but never truly alive." The tunnels ahead erupted with shrieking sounds as my words struck home. The failed candidates came pouring from side chambers, their shambling forms moving with desperate speed to intercept me before I could reach their master. But my enhanced reflexes allowed me to dance between their grasping hands, my iron knife opening wounds that bled darkness instead of blood. "The first host was probably some native shaman who thought he could control you," I continued, cutting down the corrupted things that had once been human. "But you consumed him from within, used his knowledge to perfect your methods. Each new host teaches you more about humanity, gives you better tools for hunting and deception." The creature's voice carried a note of genuine anger now. "Clever little guardian, but knowledge without power is useless. You may understand what I am, but you lack the strength to destroy me. I am eternal. I am hunger itself given form and purpose." I fought my way deeper into the cave system, following passages lit by torches that burned with cleansing fire. The creature's influence pressed against my mind like a physical weight, promising ease and companionship if I would only stop this futile resistance. Part of me, the part that was changing, wanted to listen, but the part that remembered my oath to protect innocent people drove me forward through galleries of death and chambers of unspeakable craft. Finally, I reached the heart of the cave system, a vast chamber where the original ceremonies had once been conducted. The walls were covered with petroglyphs that told the story of the creature's first arrival, its initial containment, and the gradual breakdown of the rituals that had kept it bound. In the center of the chamber sat a throne carved from what looked like human bones, fused together with substances that reflected my torchlight with oily iridescence. The creature waited there in its true form, not the patchwork of stolen skins it wore in the outer tunnels, but something far older and more terrible. It was mostly human in shape but wrong in every detail, as if someone had tried to recreate humanity from second-hand descriptions. Its skin was translucent, showing the writhing darkness that served as its true substance. Its eyes were holes in reality that led to spaces where light had never existed. "Welcome to my true home," it said, gesturing toward the petroglyphs with limbs that bent in too many directions. "Here you can see the entire history of our relationship. Your people once honored me with proper sacrifices, willing offerings that kept me fed and contained, but civilization made them forget the old bargains. They stopped feeding me, so I learned to feed myself. I raised my iron knife, its blade gleaming with reflected torchlight. The bargains were made under false pretenses. You were never a god to be worshipped. You were a prisoner to be contained. The creature rose from its throne, towering over me with supernatural height. Prisoner, I am the apex of evolution. I am what humanity could become if it abandoned the weakness of conscience and morality. Look at yourself. Already you're becoming something better, something stronger. It was right. The changes had accelerated during my journey through the caves, my body preparing for a transformation I might not be able to resist much longer. But that also meant the ritual window was closing. If the old methods were going to work, I had to act before the creature's influence became complete. I drove the iron blade into my own palm, letting blood flow onto the chamber's stone floor. The symbols carved into the walls began to glow with faint light as my partially transformed essence activated circuits of power laid down by ancient hands. The creature recoiled as if struck, its form wavering like smoke in a sudden breeze. "What are you doing?" it demanded, genuine fear creeping into its voice for the first time. I began reciting words I'd memorized from the oldest accounts, syllables in a language that predated any known human tongue. The petroglyphs blazed brighter with each phrase, their light driving back the darkness that comprised the creature's true form. This was the original binding ceremony, the ritual that had first trapped it in these caves where it could be contained and controlled. But the bindings had been designed for a creature that fed on willing sacrifices, not one that had learned to hunt and corrupt on its own. My blood alone wasn't enough to complete the ritual. It required something more, something the original shamans could never have imagined needing, the willing sacrifice of someone who understood exactly what they were destroying. The creature writhed in agony as the ancient symbols blazed with increasing intensity, their light carving deep shadows into its translucent form. But I could feel the ritual faltering, the binding incomplete without the final component that would seal it forever. My partially transformed blood had activated the old protections, but they were designed to contain something that accepted limitations, not something that had spent decades learning to break every rule. "You think you can imprison me again?" the creature hissed, its voice harmonizing with itself in frequencies that made the stone walls vibrate. "I am not the simple hunger your ancestors first encountered. I have grown, learned, evolved. These caves can no longer hold what I have become." It was right. The petroglyphs were already beginning to dim, their ancient power insufficient against a parasite that had absorbed the knowledge and cunning of 47 victims. The creature had become something beyond the original binding, a hybrid of spiritual corruption and human intelligence that could adapt to any containment. But as I watched the ritual symbols fade, I realized the ancestors had planned for this possibility. Hidden among the ceremonial markings were secondary symbols, darker and more complex than the original binding. These weren't meant to contain the creature, they were meant to destroy it. Along with anyone corrupted by its influence, the cost would be everything I had left to sacrifice. "There is another way," the creature whispered, sensing my discovery of the symbols. "You could join me willingly, add your knowledge to mine. Together we could perfect the great work, create something worthy of this ancient place. Think of the people we could save by removing them from a world bent on destruction." The offer carried genuine temptation. The transformation had progressed far enough that I could feel the creature's perspective like an overlay on my own thoughts. It saw itself as a guardian of sorts, preserving human beauty and potential in its purest form. Every skin in its collection represented someone saved from aging, from disease, from the slow corruption of civilization. In its twisted logic, murder was an act of mercy. "You're insane," I said. But my voice lacked conviction. Part of me, the part that was no longer entirely human, could see the appeal in its philosophy. "Sanity is a luxury for creatures bound by time and mortality," it replied, beginning to circle me as the ritual light continued to fade. "You've felt the hunger, haven't you? The need to preserve, to protect, to keep beautiful things safe from change. It's not madness, it's evolution." The failed candidates began emerging from the surrounding tunnels, drawn by their master's call. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, shambling through passages that connected to cave systems throughout the mountain range. Not all of them were recent. Some showed the preserved features of people who'd gone missing decades ago. Their transformations incomplete, but their humanity long since consumed. "They chose poorly," the creature explained, noting my horrified fascination. They resisted the change, fought against the gifts I offered, but they serve a purpose nonetheless. Every guardian needs servants, every artist needs apprentices. They help maintain my workshops, tend my collections, hunt for new materials when I am occupied with greater works. I understood now why the disappearances had been so carefully spaced over the years. The creature wasn't just collecting skins, it was building an army. Each failed candidate added to its workforce, creating a network of servants that could extend its influence far beyond these caves. And all of them had once been people like me, rangers and hikers and outdoor enthusiasts who'd stumbled across something they couldn't understand. "How many are there?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The creature's borrowed face split in a grin that revealed too many teeth. "Every national forest, every state park, every wilderness area where people go missing and are never found. Did you think I was the only one? Did you imagine this gift was confined to a single location?" The implications hit me like a physical blow. The creature wasn't unique. It was part of a network, a plague of spiritual parasites that had infected guardians and protectors throughout the country, each one creating its own collection, building its own army, working towards some coordinated goal that required resources beyond what any single entity could gather. "The great work," I whispered, finally understanding the scope of what I faced. "Precisely. The restoration of proper order, the return to ancient ways when humanity understood its place in the natural hierarchy. We are the apex predators this world requires, the guardians who will preserve what deserves preservation and eliminate what does not." The ritual symbols were almost completely dark now, their power exhausted without the final sacrifice needed to complete the binding. In moments, the creature would be free to resume its work, and I would either join its cause or become another failed candidate shambling through eternal darkness. But the secondary symbols, the ones meant for destruction rather than containment, still held faint traces of power. They required a different kind of sacrifice, one that would annihilate both the creature and anyone corrupted by its influence, including me. I pressed my bleeding palm against the central destruction symbol, feeling its ancient power surge through my partially transformed nervous system. The creature recoiled as if struck, its form beginning to waver like heat distortion. "What are you doing?" it screamed, genuine terror replacing its confident arrogance. "You'll destroy yourself along with me, everything you are, everything you could become." "I know," I said, beginning the ritual words that would activate the destruction sequence. "But that's better than becoming what you are." The creature lunged toward me with inhuman speed, its claws reaching for my throat before the symbols could complete their work. But the transformation had given me reflexes to match its own. I rolled aside, maintaining contact with the symbol as the creature's momentum carried it into the stone wall. "You fool!" it raged, spinning to face me with fury that distorted its stolen features beyond recognition. "Do you think your death will end this? We are eternal, we are legion. Destroying one node will accomplish nothing." Maybe it was right. Maybe there were dozens or hundreds of similar creatures throughout the wilderness areas of North America, each one building toward the same terrible goal. But I could only deal with the monster in front of me, could only take responsibility for the people this particular creature threatened. The destruction symbols blazed to life with power that made the binding ritual seem gentle by comparison. This wasn't the clean, contained force of the original ceremony. This was raw annihilation designed to sterilize an area so thoroughly that nothing corrupted could survive. The cave walls began to crack as energy that had been accumulating for millennia suddenly found release. The failed candidates collapsed as their animating force was severed. Their borrowed existence ended in an instant of merciful oblivion. The creature itself began to dissolve, its form losing coherence as the spiritual parasite that gave it shape was systematically destroyed. But its voice continued to echo through the crumbling chamber, carrying promises and threats in equal measure. "This changes nothing," it screamed as chunks of stone began falling from the ceiling. "The network will continue. Others will take my place. Your sacrifice is meaningless." Perhaps. But as I felt the annihilation force begin to consume my own corrupted cells, I found peace in knowing that at least this one threat would end here. The people whose skins decorated these walls would finally be allowed to rest. The families waiting for missing loved ones would never get answers, but at least no more innocents would join the creature's grotesque collection. The cave system began its final collapse as the destruction ritual reached its crescendo. Tons of stone fell from passages that had been carved over centuries, sealing the chambers where unspeakable crafts had been practiced. The creature made one last desperate attempt to reach me, its dissolving form stretching across the collapsing space between us. I met its gaze as the annihilation force reached my brain, feeling the last traces of its corruption burn away along with everything else that made me who I was. In that final moment, I saw something unexpected in its inhuman eyes. Not hatred or rage, but a terrible, lonely sorrow. It had been human once, long ago, before the parasite consumed everything it had been. And for just an instant, I glimpsed the ranger who'd first found these caves and made the choice that damned him. Then the mountain came down, and everything went dark. I'm writing this account from a hospital bed in Seattle, where I've spent the last 6 months recovering from what the doctors call severe delusional episodes with associated self-harm behaviors. The official report states that I was found 3 days after my disappearance, nearly dead from exposure and dehydration in a collapsed section of cave that showed signs of recent seismic activity. They say I was talking to myself when the search team found me, reciting strings of nonsense syllables while carving symbols into my own skin with a piece of broken stone. The infection from my self-inflicted wounds nearly killed me, but the physical healing has been the easy part. The psychological recovery continues under the care of specialists who nod sympathetically while I insist that my delusions were real. The cave system is gone, buried under thousands of tons of rock that shifted during what seismologists classified as a minor earthquake. The area has been declared geologically unstable and closed to public access indefinitely. Search teams found no trace of the missing hikers I claim to have seen preserved there, though they did recover some scattered camping equipment that might have belonged to previous victims. My colleagues visit occasionally, their faces mixing concern with the uncomfortable pity reserved for those who've broken under pressure. Sarah Chen has been particularly kind, assuring me that my position will be waiting when I'm ready to return to work. She doesn't mention that my clearance for solo patrols has been permanently revoked, or that any future assignments will be strictly supervised. They don't understand that I'm not broken. I'm healed. The corruption that was transforming me into something inhuman burned away with the creature that created it. The enhanced senses are gone, the predatory instincts silenced, the gnawing hunger finally satisfied. I'm completely, unremarkably human again, though the scars from my ordeal will never fully fade. But sometimes, late at night when sleep eludes me, I remember the creature's final words. "The network will continue," it had screamed as the cave collapsed around us. "Others will take my place," and I wonder if somewhere in another wilderness, another ranger is finding impossible tracks, discovering hidden clearings, beginning to understand that some guardianships require sacrifices no sane person would willingly make. The missing persons reports continue to accumulate on other desks now, scattered across jurisdictions from coast to coast. Solo hikers who vanish without trace, experienced outdoors people whose campsites show signs of struggle but no body, no blood, nature photographers whose cameras are found smashed against trees, the memory cards corrupted beyond recovery. I read these reports obsessively, looking for patterns that might indicate another node in the network has become active. Part of me knows I should let someone else handle these investigations, should focus on my own recovery and leave the monster hunting to people who haven't already paid such a price. But I'm the only one who truly understands what we're facing. The only one who knows how to recognize the signs before it's too late. The forest doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. And sometimes when the moon hangs like a wound in the night sky and the wind carries whispers of things that should not be, the forest calls to those who've walked in its deepest places. I'm planning my return to active duty for next month. Sarah doesn't know it yet, but I've requested a transfer to a district where the missing persons reports are starting to follow familiar patterns. Somewhere in the North Cascades, something is wearing faces that don't belong to it, and building collections that grow more elaborate with each kill. I can't save the people who are already gone, can't undo the choices that led them into the paths of predators that wear human skin like clothing. But I can honor their memory by ensuring their fate doesn't befall others. I can carry the knowledge bought with so much blood and use it to hunt the things that hunt us. The network thinks one destroyed node means nothing in the scope of its greater work. But they've made one critical error in their calculations. They've created their own hunter, and I know all their weaknesses now. My name is Tom Bearclaw, and it was 2007 in Sitka, Alaska when things took a turn I'll never forget. I'm tilling it, and I come from a long line of fishermen. That means I know these waters and forests like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. You grow up with legends here, stories meant to keep you sharp and respectful of what's out there in the wilderness. But that day, I got a reminder of why those legends exist. The morning started like any other in late October. I was down at the harbor checking my nets when Uncle James found me, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. He had that look on his face, the one that meant he needed a favor and wasn't quite sure how to ask. "Tom," he said, settling his weight against the dock post. "You remember Jeremiah Smith?" Of course I remembered Jeremiah. He'd been my father's fishing partner for 3 seasons back in the early 90s, before Dad died. Jeremiah was one of those mountain men from Wyoming who drifted north looking for something he never quite found. He was good people, though. Honest, hard-working, and he knew how to read the weather better than any meteorologist. "He's been up at the old Thompson cabin for about 3 weeks now," Uncle James continued. "Said he needed time to think, get away from people for a while. But winter's coming hard this year, and I promised I'd check on him." I looked up at the sky. Heavy gray clouds were building over the mountains, and the air had that metallic smell that comes before snow. The Tongass National Forest could be unforgiving even to experienced outdoorsmen, and Jeremiah, despite his skills, was pushing 70. "When do we leave?" I asked. Uncle James's relief was visible. "Soon as you can get ready. Trail's going to be rough, and I want to be back before dark." It was supposed to be a simple supply run to a family friend's cabin deep in the woods. Jeremiah had holed up there a few weeks back saying he needed time away from civilization. He'd been good friends with my father, so we checked on him from time to time, especially as winter closed in. When my Uncle James asked me to go with him to drop off some provisions, I figured it'd be another quiet trip, maybe a couple of hours. But we were in for something else entirely. We loaded James's pickup with supplies. Canned goods, coffee, propane canisters, and medical supplies. The drive out to the trailhead took 40 minutes on increasingly rough Forest Service roads. The last 5 miles were barely more than logging tracks, and twice we had to stop to move fallen branches. "I haven't seen weather this strange in years," James muttered as we parked at the trail's end. "Animals have been acting funny too. Fish and Game's been getting reports of wolves coming down closer to town, bears staying active later than they should." I shouldered my pack and checked the rifle slung across my chest, a .30-06 that had belonged to my grandfather. In southeast Alaska, you never went into the deep woods without protection. We had brown bears here, some of the largest in the world, and while attacks were rare, they happened. "Could be the warm weather we had last month," I said. Threw off their hibernation schedule, but even as I said it, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. Normally, even in late October, you'd hear the chatter of squirrels, the calling of ravens, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Today there was nothing but the crunch of our boots on the frost-covered trail. We set out just after dawn, the sky layered in thick clouds. There was a biting chill in the air, and I noticed how still everything felt, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The trail was rough, barely more than a worn path between towering pines, and each step crunched against the hard frost covering the ground. Uncle James, usually a talkative guy, was quiet as we trekked, his eyes scanning the trees, his hands gripping the rifle strapped to his chest a little tighter than usual. The Thompson cabin sat about 8 miles into the Tongass, in a small clearing beside Salmon Creek. It had been built in the 1940s by a trapper who'd eventually moved south, and over the years it had served as a shelter for hunters, researchers, and the occasional hermit like Jeremiah. The Forest Service maintained it as an emergency shelter, but it was remote enough that most people never found it. As we hiked deeper into the forest, I found myself thinking about my grandmother's stories. She used to tell me about the Koshtaka, the land otter men of Tlingit legend, shapeshifters who could take human form and lure people into the wilderness, never to be seen again. They were supposed to whistle in a particular pattern, low, high, low, 3 notes that would call to travelers in the fog. Just stories, I told myself. But in the oppressive silence of the forest, those old legends felt more real than they had in years. About 3 miles in, we stopped to rest and share some coffee from James's thermos. The silence was starting to get to both of us. "You notice how quiet it is?" I asked. James nodded grimly. "Been that way for the last week, even around town. It's like all the small animals just left. Migration season, too early for most of them." And it's not just birds. Squirrels, chipmunks, even the ravens are scarce. As we drew closer to Jeremiah's cabin, I spotted a few strange tracks in the snow along the trail. They weren't the sort of prints I'd seen before. Too big for a wolf, too narrow for a bear. They had a stretched, clawed look to them, and there was something unsettling about how they seemed to meander, circling trees and doubling back, as though whatever left them was either confused or curious. My uncle squinted at the tracks, muttering something about maybe a cougar, though even he didn't sound convinced. "Look at the stride," I said, kneeling beside one clear print. "It's irregular, like the animal was injured or what?" I didn't want to voice what I was thinking. The print looked almost like it had been made by something walking sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. The deeper impressions showed claws, but the spacing was all wrong for any animal I knew. "Probably just an old track that got distorted by the freeze-thaw cycle," James said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We pushed on, the trail winding through stands of massive Sitka spruce and western hemlock. The trees here were old growth, some of them 300 years or more, their canopy so thick that even at midday the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. The temperature seemed to drop with each mile, and a thin layer of snow began to fall. By the time we could see smoke rising from the cabin's chimney, we'd been hiking for over 3 hours. My relief at seeing the smoke was immediate. At least Jeremiah was there and keeping warm. But as we approached the small clearing, something didn't feel right. The cabin sat in a natural depression beside the creek, surrounded by towering evergreens. Jeremiah's snowshoes were propped against the wall beside the door, and there were the usual signs of occupancy. Split firewood stacked under the eaves, a path beaten down to the creek for water, a small cleared area where he'd been feeding ravens. But there were also other signs. More of those strange tracks circled the cabin, and I could see where something had been clawing at the wooden walls about 6 feet up, too high for a normal predator, and the gouges were deep, made by claws larger than anything that should exist in these woods. When we finally reached the cabin, it looked deserted. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging back and forth in the icy breeze. That was Jeremiah's first rule: keep the door closed to keep the heat in. But there it was, wide open, letting the cold creep in. Uncle James exchanged a look with me, and we both knew something was off. He motioned for me to stay back as he crept to the door, rifle raised, and I heard him call out for Jeremiah. "Jeremiah, you in there? It's James Miller and Tom Bearclaw." His voice was swallowed by the forest around us. There was no answer, just the low hum of silence that seemed to press in from all directions. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the spruce trees and the distant gurgle of Salmon Creek. I stepped in behind Uncle James, my hands balled into fists, and we both took in the scene. The cabin was dark, except for the dull light leaking through the grimy windows. On the table were tins of food, some opened and half-eaten like someone had left in a hurry. The air smelled thick and rotten, a stench that grew stronger as we moved further in. The interior of the Thompson cabin was a single room with a sleeping area partitioned off by a hanging blanket. Jeremiah had made himself at home. His sleeping bag was laid out on the old cot, his clothes hung on pegs driven into the log walls, and his supplies were neatly organized on the rough wooden shelves. A fire still smoldered in the stone fireplace, though it had burned down to coals. "Jeremiah?" James called again, his voice echoing in the small space. That's when I noticed the dark stains on the floor, irregular patches that looked almost black in the dim light. They led from the table toward the back corner of the cabin where the shadows were deepest. Then I saw it. Lying against the far wall, half hidden by shadows, was Jeremiah. Or at least what was left of him. His body was twisted, arms sprawled out, his chest torn open in a way that no animal around here could do. The flesh was gouged and ragged, deep cuts exposing raw muscle and bone. His plaid shirt was shredded, soaked through with blood that had long since dried to a rusty brown. Uncle James cursed under his breath, crossing himself. I felt bile rising but forced it down, not wanting to disrespect the dead. This wasn't just a death, it was mutilation. Jeremiah's face was frozen in an expression of terror, his eyes wide and staring at the cabin's ceiling. His right hand was outstretched, fingers clawed as if he'd been trying to drag himself away from whatever had attacked him. There were defensive wounds on his arms, deep gashes where he'd tried to protect himself. "Jesus Christ," James whispered. "What the hell did this?" I forced myself to look closer. trying to make sense of the wounds. I'd seen bear attacks before. Fish and Game had brought me in to help with investigations when tourists got too close to brown bears. Those attacks were brutal but methodical, focused on the head and neck. This was different. This was frenzied, almost ritualistic in its savagery. "Look at the claw marks," I said, pointing to the parallel gouges across Jeremiah's chest. "They're too deep, too wide-spaced for a bear. And see how they're angled? Like whatever did this was standing upright." James knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene. "We need to get word to the authorities. This is way beyond anything we can handle." But even as he said it, we both knew how long it would take for help to arrive. The state troopers were based in Juneau, hours away even by helicopter, and the weather was deteriorating. We were on our own. I walked the perimeter of the cabin's interior looking for clues. Near the fireplace, I found Jeremiah's rifle, a .300 Winchester Magnum that could drop a grizzly at 100 yards. It was loaded but unfired. Whatever had killed him had done it fast, before he could react. "There's something else," I said, pointing to scratches on the inside of the door frame. These were made from inside the cabin, like something was trying to get out. James studied the marks. They were deep gouges in the wood, made by claws that had scraped away long splinters. But the angle was wrong. They started about 5 feet up and angled downward, as if made by something much taller than a normal predator. "Maybe Jeremiah wounded it," James suggested. "Maybe it was trapped in here with him." But that didn't explain the lack of blood trails leading away from the cabin, or the fact that the door had been found open. Whatever had killed Jeremiah had apparently left the same way it came in. I was examining the scratches on the wall when I heard it. A low rumble from outside, like a growl but deeper, more resonant. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the cabin's log walls. We both froze. "Bear?" James whispered. I shook my head slowly. I'd heard plenty of bear vocalizations over the years, and this wasn't one of them. This was something else entirely. A sound that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my chest, filling me with a primal fear I couldn't explain. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by heavy footsteps circling the cabin. Not the padding of paws, but distinct footfalls, like something bipedal was walking around the building's perimeter. James raised his rifle and moved toward the window. I grabbed Jeremiah's .300 and checked the action. The bolt moved smoothly, and there was a round in the chamber. Through the small window, I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees. Something large and dark was moving through the forest with a strange, hunched gait. It would appear briefly between the tree trunks, then disappear again, always keeping to the shadows. "There," I whispered, pointing toward a break in the trees. About 50 yards out. James followed my gaze. "I don't see anything, but I could see it clearly now, or at least parts of it. Gray-brown fur matted with something dark, possibly blood, limbs that seemed too long for its body, and eyes that reflected the gray daylight like mirrors." We didn't have time to process it before something crashed outside. Heavy footsteps thundering around the cabin, stirring up gravel and snow. Uncle James signaled for me to get down, and we both ducked behind the small cot in the corner, listening. Whatever it was circled the cabin, scraping against the walls like it was feeling them. The scratching grew louder, like nails dragged across wood, slow and deliberate, as if it knew we were inside and was savoring the fact. Then, through a small gap in the wall where the chinking had fallen out, I caught a glimpse of it. I couldn't make out much, but enough to know it wasn't a bear or cougar. Its fur was matted, patches missing, revealing raw scabbed skin underneath. It moved with a hunched, unnatural gait, shoulders rolling with each step, almost like a wolf that had learned to walk on its hind legs. But the worst was the smell, a sickening blend of rot and wet fur that filled the cabin and made my eyes water. The creature stopped directly outside the window. Through the dirty glass I could see its profile, an elongated snout filled with teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. Its head was larger than any wolf's, and it seemed to be examining the cabin with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. It knew we were there. I was certain of it. The scratching stopped, and for a moment there was perfect silence. Even the wind seemed to die away. Then came a sound that made my blood freeze, a whistle. 3 notes, low, high, low, just like my grandmother's stories about the Koshtaka. But this wasn't a legend. This was real, and it was right outside. We stayed silent, hardly daring to breathe as it prowled around outside. I looked at Uncle James and he shook his head, a signal to wait. But then came a low rumble, a growl that resonated through the walls, deep and guttural. It clawed at the doorframe, its breath fogging up the small window. I saw its face briefly, a twisted, stretched snout, like a wolf's but with something all wrong about it. With teeth too sharp, too jagged, like they'd been made for ripping apart more than just prey. And then it stopped. Everything went silent, tension thick enough to feel in my chest. Uncle James nudged me, whispering that we'd need to make a break for it while we had the chance. The creature had moved away from the door, but I could still hear it somewhere in the clearing, its heavy breathing and the occasional snap of a twig under its weight. We had maybe minutes before it lost interest in playing with us and decided to come inside. We crawled out from behind the cot, moving as quietly as possible, each step timed to avoid any creak in the floorboards. The cabin's back door was only a few feet away, but it felt like miles. We had barely reached it when we heard the thing slam against the front, shaking the cabin. The entire structure groaned under the impact. Dust rained down from the ceiling beams, and I could hear wood splintering as whatever was outside threw its weight against the door. The old cabin had been built to withstand winter storms, but it wasn't designed to keep out something this powerful. James fumbled with the back door's latch, a simple wooden bar that had warped over the years. His hands were shaking, whether from cold or fear I couldn't tell. Another impact shook the cabin, and this time I heard the front door's hinges starting to give way. "Got it," James whispered as the bar finally lifted. He eased the door open just wide enough for us to slip through. The back of the cabin faced the creek, and the sound of running water would help mask our movement. At least, that was the theory. I went first, rifle ready, scanning the tree line for any sign of the creature. The forest behind the cabin was dense with undergrowth. Salmonberry bushes, devil's club, and fallen logs covered in moss. It would provide cover, but it would also hide anything that might be waiting for us. James pushed me ahead, whispering for me to run. His rifle was raised as he turned back toward the creature. I stumbled into the snow, my heart pounding, the cold biting through my skin as I forced myself to move. The plan was simple: get to the creek, follow it downstream to where it joined the main trail, then make our way back to the truck. 8 miles through rough terrain, but we both knew these woods. We could do it. That's when everything went wrong. Behind me I heard James fire, the deafening blast echoing through the trees. Once, twice, but then silence. I turned, breath caught in my throat. James was gone. His rifle lay in the snow, snapped clean in two like a dry stick. Blood stained the snow in wide arcs, trailing into the dense pines. But there was no body, no sign of a struggle. Just blood and that terrible silence. I knew better than to follow the blood trail. Whatever that thing was, it had taken him, and I didn't want to be next. The only thing left to do was run, get as far away from that cabin and whatever lurked around it. I stumbled down the trail, each crunch of snow beneath my boots making me cringe, expecting to hear something behind me. The forest was dense, shadows shifting with every step, the weight of silence pressing in on me. I didn't dare look back, focusing only on moving forward, my lungs burning with every breath. The .300 Winchester felt heavy in my hands, but its weight was reassuring. I had 4 rounds left in the magazine, plus a box of ammunition in my pack. If that thing came after me, I'd at least go down fighting, but even with the rifle, I felt helplessly exposed. The creature, whatever it was, obviously wasn't afraid of gunfire. It had taken Uncle James despite his experience and his weapon. What chance did I have? I tried to focus on the immediate tasks. Keep moving, stay on the trail, watch for landmarks. Salmon Creek was to my left, gurgling over rocks and fallen logs. As long as I could hear it, I was heading in the right direction. The snow was falling harder now. Big flakes that stuck to my jacket and obscured my vision. The temperature was dropping fast, and I could feel the cold seeping through my boots. If I had to spend the night out here, hypothermia would be as dangerous as any predator. About a mile from the cabin, I stopped to catch my breath and check my bearings. The trail here followed the creek closely, winding between massive old-growth trees that rose like cathedral pillars into the gray sky. Everything looked familiar, but in the fading light and falling snow, it was hard to be certain. That's when I heard it. A howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It started low and built to a crescendo that made my teeth ache, then trailed off into a series of shorter barks. But it wasn't quite a wolf's howl. There was something wrong with the pitch, the timing, as if whatever was making the sound was trying to imitate a wolf but couldn't quite manage it. The howl came again, closer this time, and I realized with growing horror that it was tracking me. Following my scent or my tracks through the snow, getting closer with each passing minute. I forced myself to move faster, half running, half stumbling down the increasingly treacherous trail. My breath came in short gasps, and I could taste copper in my mouth from the exertion. Behind me, I could hear branches breaking, the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. It knew it had me. The trail descended steeply here, following the creek as it carved its way through a narrow ravine. On both sides, the walls rose 30 feet or more, covered in slick moss and stunted trees. There was nowhere to go but forward. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. Something was following me, moving through the trees with an unnatural, loping gait. In the failing light, I could only make out its silhouette, but it was clearly massive, larger than any wolf, moving sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. The howl came again, much closer now, and this time I could hear something else in it. Intelligence. Purpose. This wasn't just an animal following its instincts. This was something that was enjoying the hunt. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. The Koshtaka take people into the wilderness and they never come back. They become like the creature themselves, forever lost. But this was no legend. This was a real predator, and I was its prey. The ravine began to open up ahead, and I could see where the creek joined a larger stream, the main drainage that would eventually lead me back to the truck. But I also realized that the creature had been herding me, using the terrain to funnel me toward this exact spot. As I emerged from the ravine, I saw why. The creature was already there, waiting in the clearing where the 2 streams met. It stood on its hind legs like a man, but its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too angular, with arms that hung nearly to the ground. Its head was lupine but oversized, and its eyes reflected the dim light like polished stones. When it saw me, it dropped to all 4s and charged. I raised the rifle and fired, the 300's roar echoing off the ravine walls. The bullet struck the creature's center mass, and it stumbled but didn't stop. I worked the bolt and fired again, this time aiming for the head. The shot went wide as the creature zigzagged across the clearing with impossible speed. It was on me before I could chamber a 3rd round. Up close, the smell was overwhelming. Rot and musk and something else. Something that made my primitive brain scream in recognition of a predator perfectly designed to kill humans. I swung the rifle like a club, catching the creature across the snout. It yelped and backed off momentarily, giving me time to work the bolt and chamber another round. But as I raised the rifle to fire, the creature did something that made my blood freeze. It smiled, not the bared teeth of an angry animal, but an actual smile. Lips pulled back to reveal rows of teeth that looked almost human except for their size and sharpness. And in its eyes, I saw an intelligence that was distinctly, terrifyingly aware. I pulled the trigger, but the creature had already moved. The bullet whistled harmlessly through the air as it circled me with predatory grace, always staying just out of range, forcing me to keep turning to track it. That's when I realized it was playing with me. It could have killed me already. It had been fast enough to take Uncle James before he could get off more than 2 shots. But it was drawing this out, savoring my fear. The creature stopped circling and stood upright again, regarding me with those reflective eyes. When it spoke, my world tilted on its axis. "Run," it said in a voice like gravel being ground together. "Run, little fish." I ran. Pure terror drove me forward as my rational mind shattered into fragments. That thing, whatever it was, could speak. Not just animal vocalizations, but actual words. The implications were too horrible to process. So I simply ran, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal. Behind me, I could hear it following at a leisurely pace, occasionally letting out that horrible, not quite wolf howl. It was toying with me, letting me exhaust myself before moving in for the kill. The forest closed in around me as I left the main trail, plunging into the dense undergrowth of the Tongass rainforest. Here, beneath the canopy of ancient Sitka spruce and western hemlock, the world existed in perpetual twilight. Devil's Club tore at my clothes with thorns like razor wire. and fallen logs created a maze of obstacles that forced me to climb and crawl and squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for a human body. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put distance between myself and that abomination, to find someplace where I could think, where I could figure out what the hell I was dealing with. The creature's howl echoed through the trees, and I realized it was circling me again, staying just out of sight but close enough to keep me moving. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I would hear branches breaking or see a shadow moving between the trees, and I would be forced to continue. My legs felt like lead, and my lungs burned from the exertion. The rifle had become almost too heavy to carry, but I clutched it anyway. It was my only protection, even though the bullets seemed to have little effect on the creature. As I struggled through a particularly dense thicket, my grandmother's stories came flooding back. The Koshtaka were shapeshifters, creatures that could take human form to lure victims into the wilderness, but they weren't just legends. They were warnings, passed down through generations of Tlingit people who had encountered something real and terrible in these forests. But if the legends were true, what was I really dealing with? Some kind of evolved predator that had learned to mimic human speech? A diseased animal whose behavior had been altered by parasites or infection? Or something else entirely? My scientific mind tried to rationalize what I'd seen, but the evidence was overwhelming. The creature was too large to be a normal wolf, too intelligent to be driven purely by instinct, and its wounds from my rifle shots should have slowed it down significantly. Instead, it seemed completely unaffected. I stumbled into a small clearing where a massive spruce tree had fallen years ago, creating a natural shelter beneath its upturned root system. The space was just large enough for me to crawl inside, and the thick roots would provide some protection from the creature's claws. I squeezed into the makeshift shelter and tried to control my breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the creature would be able to hear it from miles away. Through gaps in the roots, I could see the clearing beyond, watching for any sign of movement. For several minutes, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant sound of running water. I began to hope that maybe I'd lost it, that the creature had given up the chase and moved on to easier prey. Then I heard the whistle. 3 notes, low, high, low, coming from somewhere uncomfortably close. The sound seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones, triggering some ancestral memory of terror that made my hands shake uncontrollably. "Little fish," came that grinding voice from just outside my shelter. Little fish hiding in the roots. I could see its feet now, or what passed for feet. They were enormous, with claws that looked more like talons, and they moved with deliberate precision as the creature circled my hiding place. "I can smell you," it continued, and I could hear the amusement in its voice. "Smell your fear. Taste it in the air." The rifle trembled in my hands as I tried to aim through the gaps in the roots. If I could get a clean shot at close range, maybe I could put it down. But every time I thought I had a clear target, it would move, staying just out of sight. "Your friend tasted good," the creature said conversationally. "Tough meat, but good flavor. Full of fear, like you." I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle a sob. Uncle James was dead, torn apart by this monstrosity, and I was next. The creature was just playing with me, savoring my terror before moving in for the kill. "But you're different," it continued. "You have the old blood. I can smell it, taste it. Your ancestors knew my kind, feared us, respected us." Through a gap in the roots, I caught a glimpse of its face. Up close, I could see that it wasn't entirely wolf-like. The bone structure was wrong, the skull too large and elongated. And the eyes, those terrible intelligent eyes, were definitely not animal. "Some of your people joined us willingly," the creature said, and now it was crouched down, speaking directly toward my hiding place. "Became like us, hunters instead of prey. Would you like that, little fish? Would you like to stop running?" I couldn't take it anymore. I shoved the rifle barrel through the gap and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the confined space, and I felt the bullet's impact travel up the gun's stock. The creature shrieked, a sound like metal being torn apart, and I heard it crash away through the underbrush. When I looked through the gap, I could see dark blood on the snow where it had been standing. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe I'd hit something vital. Maybe it would bleed out and leave me alone. But even as I thought it, I knew I was kidding myself. The creature had taken multiple rifle shots already and barely seemed affected. I crawled out of my shelter and examined the blood trail. The droplets were dark, almost black, and they seemed to steam slightly in the cold air. The smell was indescribable, not like any animal blood I'd ever encountered. The trail led deeper into the forest, toward the heart of the Tongass where few humans ever ventured. I had a choice: follow it and try to finish what I'd started, or head back toward the main trail and hope I could reach the truck before the creature recovered. It wasn't really a choice at all. I had to get out of these woods before full darkness fell. In the dark, I'd be completely at the creature's mercy. I oriented myself using the moss growth on the trees and the lay of the land. The main trail was roughly northeast of my position, maybe 2 miles through dense forest. If I could maintain my direction and avoid getting lost, I might make it before the creature decided to resume its hunt. But even with the fading afternoon light to guide me, the forest seemed determined to confuse my sense of direction. Every tree looked the same. Every fallen log became a landmark I was sure I'd passed before. The temperature continued to drop, and the snow was falling more heavily now, obscuring tracks and filling in my footprints almost as soon as I made them. Eventually I broke through to a clearing, the familiar path leading back to town just visible in the distance. I almost sobbed with relief. But then in the corner of my eye I caught a glimpse of movement, just the faintest shift between the trees, something dark and hunched, watching me, calculating. Its face, that twisted, too-wide grin, was seared into my memory as I bolted, pushing myself harder, fueled by a fear I couldn't even begin to understand. The creature had been waiting for me. It had known exactly where I was going and had gotten there first. How was that possible? Did it know these woods better than I did? Or was there something else about its nature that I didn't understand? I ran down the trail as fast as I dared, my boots slipping on the increasingly icy surface. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the forest, no longer bothering to move quietly. The hunt was entering its final phase. When I finally reached town, I collapsed near the main road, gasping, cold sweat slick against my skin despite the freezing temperature. My legs wouldn't support me anymore, and I lay in the snow for several minutes, simply trying to convince myself that I was still alive. The lights of Sitka seemed impossibly bright after hours in the forest twilight. Cars passed on the road, their headlights creating pools of normalcy that made my experience seem like a nightmare I was just waking up from. But the weight of the rifle in my hands and the taste of fear in my mouth were proof that it had all been real. I looked around, half expecting someone to come running to tell them what had happened. But then I thought of Uncle James, of the way his blood had soaked into the snow. There were no bones, no traces beyond that cabin, nothing to show what that thing had done. How could I explain what I'd seen? How could I make anyone believe that there was something in the Tongass that defied every natural law? Something that could speak and reason and hunt with supernatural intelligence. I stumbled to the nearest house and pounded on the door until Mrs. Kowalski answered. She took one look at me, covered in scratches, soaked in sweat and melted snow, clutching a rifle with shaking hands, and immediately called the state troopers. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions and disbelief. I told them about finding Jeremiah's body, about the attack at the cabin, about Uncle James's disappearance, but I left out the parts they would never believe. The creature's intelligence, its ability to speak, the way it had hunted me through the forest like a game. Instead, I focused on the evidence they could verify. A man was dead at the Thompson cabin. Another was missing. Something dangerous was in the woods. The troopers organized a search party that left at first light. I wanted to go with them, but the medic had insisted I be checked for hypothermia and exhaustion. By the time I was cleared to leave the hospital, the searchers had already found the cabin. They confirmed Jeremiah's death and the presence of Uncle James's broken rifle. But they had their own theories about what had happened. Mauling by a brown bear, they said. Probably a sow with cubs who had been surprised in her winter den. James had likely been dragged off and partially consumed, which would explain the lack of a body. But the tracks, I insisted. The claw marks were all wrong for a bear. The lead investigator, Sergeant Morrison, nodded sympathetically. Trauma can affect perception, Mr. Bearclaw. You went through a terrible experience. It's natural for your mind to fill in details that might not have been there. They found some of the tracks I'd described, but by then the snow had obscured most of the detail. The claw marks on the cabin walls could have been made by a large bear standing on its hind legs. The broken rifle could have been stepped on during the attack. Everything had a rational explanation if you were willing to accept that explanation and ignore the parts that didn't fit. The townspeople never did find Jeremiah or James, though a search party combed the woods for days. I heard some say they found signs, strange claw marks carved into trees, mutilated animal carcasses scattered around like offerings. They said whatever it was had long since moved on. But I know better. The official cause of death was listed as animal attack, species unknown. Jeremiah's body was shipped south to his family in Wyoming. Uncle James was declared missing, presumed dead. Life went on. It always does. But 3 weeks later, I was down at the harbor when I heard it again. That distinctive whistle, 3 notes carried on the wind from the direction of the forest. Low, high, low, just like my grandmother had described. Just like the creature had made before it attacked. I looked around, but no one else seemed to have heard it. The other fishermen continued their work, oblivious to the sound that made my blood freeze. That night I went to see my grandmother. She was 92 and spent most of her time in a nursing home now, but her mind was still sharp when it mattered. I found her in the common room, working on a traditional Tlingit blanket. "Grandmother," I said, sitting beside her chair, "I need to ask you about the old stories. About the Costa Ka." She looked up at me with eyes that had seen nearly a century of changes in our world. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she set down her weaving and spoke in Tlingit, words I only half understood. "What did you say?" I said the land otter men are not stories, she replied in English. "They are warnings. Your great-grandfather saw one during the winter of 1918. It killed 3 men in the village before the shamans drove it away." "How did they drive it away?" She shrugged. "Fire, noise, numbers. The creatures are strong, but they are few. They avoid large groups of people. But what are they really? Some kind of animal? A disease?" My grandmother studied my face for a long time before answering. "What does it matter what name you give them? They exist. They hunt. They kill. That is enough." "The one I saw could speak," I said quietly. "It talked to me." Her expression didn't change. "Yes, they learn. They listen. They take the words from the people they catch." The implications of that statement made my skin crawl. How many people had that creature killed to learn human speech? How long had it been hunting in our forests? "There are others?" I asked. "There have always been others, in the deep places where people rarely go. They are part of the land, like the bears and wolves, but smarter. More dangerous." I left the nursing home with more questions than answers, but at least I knew I wasn't going insane. The creature I'd encountered was real, part of a larger population of predators that had learned to hunt humans with near-perfect efficiency. Over the following months, I researched everything I could find about similar encounters. There were scattered reports throughout Alaska and northern Canada. Missing persons cases with unusual circumstances, animal attacks that didn't quite fit the normal patterns, sightings of creatures that didn't match any known species. I also learned about rabies outbreaks in the region. Arctic fox rabies is enzootic populations of Arctic and red fox populations along Alaska's northern and western coasts, and rabid animals often lose their fear of humans and may become vicious and attack for no reason. They may appear weak or paralyzed and sometimes chew rocks, dog chains, and other non-food items. The symptoms matched some of what I'd observed: the creature's strange behavior, its lack of normal predator caution, the way it seemed to enjoy the hunt rather than simply killing for food. But rabies didn't explain the creature's size, its intelligence, or its ability to speak. There had to be something else, some factor I wasn't considering. The answer came to me 6 months later, when Fish and Game called me to consult on another unusual case. A hunter had been found dead near Lake Eva, about 40 miles north of Sitka. The circumstances were similar to Jeremiah's death. Massive trauma, evidence of a large predator, but details that didn't quite fit any known animal. The interesting thing, the wildlife biologist told me, is that we found gray wolf DNA at the scene, but also human DNA that didn't match the victim. Human DNA mixed in with the saliva samples from the bite marks. Like whatever attacked him was part human. The pieces began to fall into place. Hybridization between wolves and dogs was common, but what if something similar had happened between wolves and humans, not through normal reproduction, That was genetically impossible, but through disease, parasites, or some other biological mechanism, the rabies virus is a neurotropic virus, which causes severe neurological manifestations in affected individuals, including behavioral changes and paralysis followed by death typically within days. But what if some individuals didn't die? What if the virus or some similar pathogen caused mutations instead of death, creating something that was neither fully human nor fully animal? It would explain the creature's human-like intelligence and its ability to learn speech. It would explain why it seemed to know the forest better than any normal predator, and it would explain why my bullets had so little effect. If the creature had once been human, it might have retained enough of that biology to survive injuries that would kill a normal animal. I never found concrete proof of my theory. The creature, whatever it was, never appeared again in areas where it might be captured or studied. But I know it's still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of Southeast Alaska. Hunting, learning, waiting. People still go missing in the Tongass. Hikers who never return from day trips. Hunters who disappear without a trace. The authorities blame bears, wolves, avalanches, exposure, anything except the truth. But I know what's really happening. The Koshika are still among us just as they've always been. They've learned to be more careful, more selective in their hunting. They take the solitary travelers, the ones who won't be missed immediately, the ones whose disappearance can be explained by more conventional dangers. And sometimes on clear nights when the wind is blowing from the forest, I still hear that whistle. 3 notes carried on the air like a promise and a threat, low, high, low. The sound of something that was once human, but is human no longer. The sound of the wild reclaiming what civilization thought it had tamed. I tell people now to stay out of the deep woods, especially alone. I tell them to carry weapons, to travel in groups, to never follow strange sounds in the forest. Most of them think I'm just another traumatized survivor, seeing monsters where there are only natural predators. But some listen, some understand, and maybe that's enough. The old warnings exist for a reason. The legends persist because they're based on truth. And in the trackless wilderness of Alaska, where civilization is still just a thin veneer over something much older and more dangerous, those truths are as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. The Koshtaka are real, and they're still hunting. My name is Ayana, and I became a park ranger at Glacier National Park for the same reason most people run toward danger instead of away from it. Because someone I love died there, and I needed answers. 3 years ago, my brother Kota vanished during a solo hiking trip on the Highline Trail. The official report listed him as another casualty of the wilderness, inexperienced hiker, poor weather conditions, probable fall into a ravine, case closed. But Kota had been hiking these mountains since he could walk. He knew every trail marker, every weather pattern, every dangerous drop-off in a 100-mile radius. The explanation never sat right with me, so when the ranger position opened at the remote Bowman Lake Station, I applied immediately. The posting was for a solo assignment. A cabin overlooking the lake, responsible for a 40-square-mile section of backcountry that saw maybe 24 visitors per season. Perfect for someone who wanted to search without interference. The station supervisor, a weathered man named Joaquin, met me at the trailhead on my first day. His handshake was firm, but his eyes held a warning I couldn't quite interpret. "You sure about this assignment?" he asked, shouldering one of my supply packs. "It's isolated out there, real isolated. Last ranger lasted 8 months before he requested a transfer." "What happened to him?" Joaquin's jaw tightened. Said he couldn't handle the quiet. Some people aren't cut out for that much solitude. The hike to the cabin took 3 hours through dense forest that grew progressively darker as we climbed. Ancient cedars towered overhead, their canopy so thick that midday felt like dusk. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and that particular smell of untouched wilderness. Earth and moss and something indefinably wild. Bowman Lake appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, its surface like black glass reflecting the surrounding peaks. The water was so still it looked solid, unmarked by even the smallest ripple. The cabin sat on a small rise about 50 yards from the shore, a sturdy log structure with a wraparound porch and large windows facing the water. "Radio works most of the time," Joaquin explained as we climbed the porch steps. "Weather can interfere with transmission, so don't panic if you lose contact for a day or two." Supply drops happen every 2 weeks, weather permitting. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom, and an office area with maps covering every wall. Red pins marked hiking trails, blue ones marked campsites, and scattered black pins marked what the legend called incident locations. "What kind of incidents?" I asked. Joaquin paused in the doorway, pack still slung over his shoulder. "Missing persons mostly, folks who wander off trail and get turned around. This terrain can be tricky. Lots of dead-end valleys and false ridges, easy to get confused, especially when the weather turns." He pointed to a cluster of black pins near the northern boundary of my patrol area. That section's had the most problems. Hikers report strange echoes, voices calling from the woods, usually just sound bouncing off the rock faces, but it can be disorienting. Keep that in mind if you get any lost hiker reports from that area. After Joaquin left, I spent the evening reviewing the incident files. Most were routine, day hikers who'd taken wrong turns, campers who'd gotten spooked by wildlife sounds and called for assistance. But buried in the stack, I found 3 reports that made my pulse quicken. The first was from 2 years ago. A couple camping near Hidden Lake reported hearing someone calling for help around midnight. They'd followed the voice deeper into the woods for almost an hour before realizing they'd lost the trail entirely. When they finally found their way back to camp at dawn, exhausted and scratched from bushwhacking through underbrush, they discovered their tent had been torn open and their food scattered. The second report was from last summer. A solo hiker claimed he'd been followed for 6 miles by someone calling his name. He never saw who it was, but the voice stayed just out of sight behind trees or around bends in the trail. When he finally reached the ranger station, he was nearly hysterical, insisting that the voice had known details about his life that no stranger could possibly know. The third report was filed just 4 months ago, 2 weeks before my predecessor had requested his transfer. A family of 4 had been camping at Bowman Lake when their youngest child, a 7-year-old girl, wandered away from their campsite. The parents found her 3 hours later, standing waist-deep in the lake, staring across the water. When they asked what she was doing, she said she'd been talking to her grandmother, who had died 2 years earlier. The grandmother had been calling to her from across the lake, telling her to come swimming. I set the files aside and walked out onto the porch. The lake stretched before me, perfectly still under a canopy of stars. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of civilization. Just the kind of deep quiet that made you strain your ears, searching for any sound to break the oppressive stillness. That's when I heard it. A faint call drifting across the water, too distant to make out words but unmistakably human. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the far shore, but the beam barely reached halfway across the lake. The sound came again, clearer this time. "Ayana?" My blood went cold. It was my name, spoken in a voice I almost recognized. Almost, but not quite. Like a familiar voice played through a broken radio, distorted just enough to make my skin crawl. I stood on that porch for 20 minutes, listening, but the voice didn't come again. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an echo. Maybe another camper calling out, the sound bouncing off the water and rock faces until it reached me as a meaningless approximation of my name. But as I lay in bed that first night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the absolute silence outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in those woods knew I was here. And more disturbing still, it knew who I was. I'd come to find answers about Koda's disappearance. Instead, I was beginning to suspect I'd walked into the same trap that had claimed him. The last thing I remembered before falling asleep was the sound of footsteps on the porch outside, slow, deliberate steps that circled the cabin twice before stopping directly outside my bedroom window. But when I crept to the window and peered through the curtains, nothing was there except the empty darkness and the still, black surface of the lake. My second day on the job brought my first real emergency. I was reviewing trail maps when the radio crackled to life around noon. "Bowman Lake Station, this is base. We've got a missing hiker report, over." I grabbed the microphone. "This is Ranger Ayana. Go ahead, base. 23-year-old male, name of Marcus Chen. Last seen yesterday morning heading north from Hidden Lake Campground. Planned to be back by evening. Family's worried." I traced the route on my map. Hidden Lake was about 8 miles northeast of my position, connected by a network of trails that wound through some of the most remote country in the park. If Chen had gotten lost up there, he could be anywhere within a 50-square-mile area. I'll head out immediately, I radioed back. EEA to Hidden Lake about 3 hours. Copy that. Be advised weather service is calling for possible thunderstorms this evening. Don't take any unnecessary risks. I packed my gear quickly. First aid kit, emergency shelter, extra food and water, GPS unit, flare gun. The hike to Hidden Lake took me through terrain that grew progressively wilder as I climbed. The lower trails were well maintained, but as I gained elevation, the path became rougher, marked only by occasional blazes carved into tree trunks. Hidden Lake sat in a cirque surrounded by towering granite walls. The campground was little more than a few cleared spaces near the shore where backpackers could pitch tents. I found Chen's abandoned campsite easily enough. A small dome tent, camp stove, and backpack sitting exactly where he'd left them. His sleeping bag was neatly rolled, his gear organized. Nothing suggested a hasty departure or struggle. I called out his name, listening as my voice echoed off the surrounding cliffs. The sound bounced back and forth, distorting until it no longer sounded like my voice at all. Then silence returned, thick and oppressive. Chen's trail led northeast from the campsite, following what appeared to be a game path rather than any official trail. I marked my GPS position and began tracking him, following broken twigs, disturbed vegetation, and the occasional boot print in soft earth. The trail led steadily upward through dense forest. After about 2 miles, I found the first sign that something was wrong. Chen's water bottle, half full, sitting upright on a fallen log as if carefully placed there. No hiker abandons water in the backcountry, especially not like this. I called his name again, louder this time. The echo came back strange, seeming to split into multiple voices calling from different directions. One of those voices sounded like it was answering, "Here, over here." The call came from somewhere ahead and to my left, off the main trail. I pushed through thick underbrush toward the sound, following what might have been a deer path. The voice called again, definitely male, definitely distressed. "Help me! I'm hurt!" I broke into a run, crashing through branches and jumping over fallen logs. The voice stayed ahead of me, always just out of sight around the next tree or over the next rise. It led me deeper into increasingly dense forest, where the canopy blocked most of the sunlight and the air felt thick and still. "Where are you?" I shouted. "Here? Keep coming." But something was wrong with the voice. It was the same words, the same tone, but there was an artificial quality to it, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. I slowed, then stopped completely. I was standing in a small clearing surrounded by massive cedar trees. The voice had been coming from directly ahead, but there was no one there. No injured hiker, no signs of recent passage, just empty forest and in silence so complete it felt hostile. That's when I noticed the trees. Every cedar in the clearing had deep gouges in its bark, parallel scratches that ran from about 4 feet off the ground up to a height of 8 or 9 feet. The marks were fresh, the wood beneath still pale and wet. They looked like claw marks, but no bear or mountain lion was large enough to reach that high. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The response came from behind me. "Ayana." I spun around, hand instinctively going to the bear spray on my belt. Nothing there but trees and shadows. But the voice had been close, maybe 20 feet away, and it had known my name. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, from somewhere off to my right, "This way, Ayana. I need help." The voice was different now. Still male, but older, with a slight accent I couldn't place. It was also coming from the opposite direction than before, which should have been impossible if it was the same person. I pulled out my GPS unit and checked my position. According to the device, I was more than a mile off any marked trail, in an area where the topographic map showed nothing but wilderness. Worse, I'd been following the voice for almost an hour and had somehow gained nearly 800 feet in elevation without realizing it. The terrain around me was all wrong for where I thought I was. The voice called again, closer now. "Ayana, please, I'm bleeding." But this time I heard something that made my skin crawl. The voice had a hollow quality, like someone speaking through a long tube, and underneath the words, almost too faint to detect, was another sound. A wet, clicking noise that definitely wasn't human. I backed away slowly, trying to retrace my path, but the forest around me looked completely unfamiliar. Every tree seemed identical, every shadow deeper and more threatening than before. I was lost, and something in these woods was using Chen's voice to lead me deeper into the wilderness. The radio on my belt crackled with static. Then Joaquin's voice. Bauman Lake Station, please respond. Over. I fumbled for the microphone. Base, this is Ayana. I'm tracking the missing hiker, but I may have a problem. Something's not right up here. Say again? You're breaking up badly? I tried to respond, but the radio produced only static. I was on my own. The voice called out once more, and this time it was unmistakably Chen. Ranger! Thank God! I'm down here. The sound was coming from somewhere below me, as if he'd fallen into a ravine. I approached carefully, scanning the ground for any drop-off or hole where someone might have fallen. Instead, I found something that made my blood run cold. At the base of the largest cedar tree was a small pile of belongings, a hiking boot, a torn piece of fabric that looked like it came from a jacket, and a wallet. I opened the wallet with trembling hands and found Marcus Chen's driver's license. The voice called again from directly beneath my feet. Help me up. I can't climb out. But I was standing on solid ground. There was no ravine, no hole, nothing that could explain where the voice was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from underground, from somewhere deep beneath the forest floor. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, following my GPS back toward familiar territory. While behind me the voice kept calling, sometimes Chen's voice, sometimes others, sometimes a woman's voice that sounded terrifyingly like my own mother. They called my name, pleaded for help, described injuries and locations that couldn't possibly exist. By the time I made it back to Chen's campsite, the sun was setting and storm clouds were gathering overhead. I radioed for backup, then spent a sleepless night in my tent, listening to voices calling from the darkness. Dozens of them all around the lake, all asking for help that I knew better than to provide. Marcus Chen was never found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to exposure. But I knew better. Whatever was in those woods had taken him, just like it had probably taken Coda, and now it knew I was here, and it was calling my name. The search for Marcus Chen was officially called off after 5 days, but I continued looking on my own time. I mapped every trail, every game path, every deer run within 10 miles of his last known location. What I found wasn't evidence of Chen. It was evidence of something far worse. The disappearances went back decades. Buried in old ranger reports, newspaper clippings, and missing person files, I found a pattern that should have been obvious to anyone who cared to look. Every 3 to 5 years, someone vanished in the same general area. The victims were always solo hikers, always experienced outdoorsmen, and always last heard calling for help before vanishing completely. I spread the documents across my cabin floor like pieces of a puzzle. 1987, John Reeves, experienced climber, disappeared while attempting a solo ascent. His climbing gear was found arranged neatly at the base of the cliff, but his body was never recovered. 1991, Patricia Voss, wildlife photographer, vanished while tracking a rare bird species. Her camera was found containing dozens of photos of empty forest, as if she'd been photographing something that didn't show up on film. 1995, Miguel Santos, park naturalist, went missing during a routine survey. His notes, found weeks later, described voices in the trees and something watching from the shadows. The pattern continued through the years, right up to Coda's disappearance 3 years ago. Each incident involved someone being lured off the established trails by voices calling for help. Each victim was found to have left behind personal items arranged in small, deliberate piles. And in every case, other hikers in the area reported hearing their names being called by unfamiliar voices. But the most disturbing discovery was what I found in the margins of Miguel Santos's field notes. His handwriting became increasingly erratic in the days before his disappearance, and his final entries described something that made my hands shake as I read them. Day 12. The voices are getting stronger. They know things about me, personal things. How is that possible? Day 13. Found another pile today. Fresh. Someone's been here recently, but I haven't seen anyone for 3 days. Day 14. They're not human. I don't know what they are, but they're not human. They can copy voices perfectly, but there's something wrong with the timing, like they're repeating recorded sounds. Day 15. I think they're feeding on something. The forest around the piles is different, healthier, greener, like the soil has been enriched. Day 16. They know I know. I can hear my own voice calling to me from the woods. If something happens to me, the answer is in the old growth section. Look for the feeding ground. The old growth section had to be the ancient cedar grove where I'd lost Chen's trail. I'd avoided that area since my first encounter, but if Santos was right, that's where I'd find answers. I spent 3 days preparing for the expedition. I couldn't rely on radio communication. The voices seemed to interfere with electronics somehow. Instead, I left detailed notes in my cabin describing my planned route and timeline. If I didn't return within 48 hours, anyone who found the notes would at least know where to start looking. The hike to the cedar grove took most of the morning. I approached cautiously, every sense alert for any sign of the presence I'd encountered before. The forest was eerily quiet. No bird songs, no insect sounds. Even the wind seemed muted. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. The grove looked different in daylight. The trees were even more massive than I'd remembered, their trunks easily 10 or 12 feet in diameter. But what caught my attention were the patterns in the bark. What I'd taken for claw marks were actually something else entirely, intricate spirals and geometric shapes carved deep into the living wood. The patterns were old, weathered smooth by decades of exposure, and they covered every tree in the grove. At the center of the grove was a depression in the earth about 20 feet across. The soil here was different, richer, darker, almost black, and scattered throughout the depression were dozens of personal items. Hiking boots, jackets, cameras, water bottles, GPS units, all arranged in neat piles, all showing signs of having been there for different lengths of time. I was looking at a feeding ground. I approached the nearest pile carefully, using a stick to turn over the items without touching them directly. A moldy hiking boot, a rusted compass, a wallet so decomposed I couldn't open it. These weren't recent losses, they'd been here for years. That's when I heard it. A wet, sliding sound coming from somewhere above me. I looked up into the canopy and immediately wished I hadn't. Something was moving between the branches 40 feet overhead. It was roughly human-shaped but wrong in every detail. Too long, too pale, moving in ways that defied anatomy. Its limbs bent at impossible angles as it flowed through the branches like liquid, never quite solid enough to get a clear look at. Then it spoke, and its voice was Marcus Chen's. "Ayana, you found me. I'm hurt bad. Can you climb up here?" I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the thing in the trees. It moved to stay directly above me, shifting from branch to branch without ever making the kind of noise a living creature should make moving through dry leaves and twigs. "Please," it said, and now the voice was Coda's. "I've been waiting for you. I knew you'd come looking for me." The voice was perfect. Not just Coda's words, but his inflection, his accent, even the slight raspiness he'd developed after breaking his nose in a climbing accident. If I'd heard it over the phone, I would have sworn it was him. "You're not Coda?" I said aloud. "I am," it replied, and I could hear the smile in the voice. "I'm everyone who's come here. We all become part of the same thing. You can join us, Ayana. It doesn't hurt." More shapes appeared in the canopy around me. Pale, flowing forms that moved between the trees like living shadows. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. And they were all speaking now. A chorus of stolen voices calling my name, pleading with me, promising me things I'd always wanted to hear. My mother's voice. "I'm so proud of you, honey." Coda's voice. "I never blamed you for what happened." My father's voice. "Come home, Ayana. We're all here." But underneath the familiar voices was that same wet, clicking sound I'd heard before. The real sound these things made when they weren't pretending to be human. I understood now why the other victims had been lured off the trails. The voices weren't just mimicry, they were psychologically targeted, offering exactly what each person most wanted to hear. For a lost hiker, it would be rescue. For someone searching for a missing loved one, it would be reunion. The creatures fed on human desire, using it to draw their prey into the feeding ground. But I also understood something else. They couldn't leave the grove. All the disappearances had happened within a 5-mile radius of this spot. The creatures were bound to this place somehow, dependent on it. They could project their voices farther, but they couldn't venture beyond their territory. The voices were getting more insistent now, more desperate. They sensed I was about to leave. "Don't go," Coda's voice pleaded. "You've searched for so long. Don't you want to know what really happened to me?" I did want to know, more than anything. But I also knew that whatever these things were, they weren't offering knowledge. They were offering consumption. The feeding ground wasn't just where they brought their prey, it was where they absorbed them, adding their voices to the choir that would lure the next victim. I started backing toward the edge of the grove, and the voices became frantic. They overlapped now, dozens of people I'd known calling my name simultaneously. The sound was overwhelming, disorienting, but I forced myself to keep moving. At the edge of the grove, I turned and ran. Behind me, the voices faded to angry whispers, then to the wet clicking sounds, then finally to silence. I didn't stop running until I reached my cabin. Only then did I realize that my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I'd found the feeding ground. I'd learned what happened to the missing hikers, but I still didn't know how to stop it, and I knew with absolute certainty that the creatures wouldn't give up. They'd tasted my presence now, heard my voice. They would find a way to call me back. The only question was whether I'd be strong enough to resist when they did. After my encounter at the feeding ground, I should have reported what I'd found and requested immediate transfer. Any sane person would have. Instead, I began researching everything I could find about the history of Glacier National Park, focusing specifically on the area around Bowman Lake. What I discovered in the archives at park headquarters made me understand that this problem was far older and more complex than I'd imagined. The Blackfeet tribe had lived in this region for thousands of years before the park was established. Their oral histories, recorded by anthropologists in the early 1900s, contained repeated references to an area they called the Hungry Place, a grove of ancient trees where voices of the dead could be heard calling to the living. According to the stories, the trees themselves were alive in a way that normal plants were not, and they sustained themselves by consuming the life force of anyone foolish enough to enter their domain. The Blackfeet had specific rituals for dealing with the Hungry Place. They would leave offerings at the edge of the grove, food, tools, personal items to appease whatever lived there. Most importantly, they taught their children never to follow voices calling from the deep forest, no matter how familiar they sounded. But when the area became a national park in 1910, that traditional knowledge was dismissed as primitive superstition. The new park rangers were educated men from back east who believed in science and rational thought. They had no time for Native American folklore. The first recorded disappearance occurred in 1913, just 3 years after the park opened. A government surveyor named Robert Hayes vanished while mapping the northern boundary. His equipment was found neatly arranged at the base of a large cedar tree, but his body was never recovered. The official report blamed a bear attack despite the complete absence of any evidence of predation. Similar incidents occurred every few years throughout the early decades of the park's history. Each time, the official explanation was wildlife encounter, exposure, or equipment failure. The pattern was never acknowledged because no one wanted to admit that there might be something in the wilderness that science couldn't explain. But buried in the old files, I found evidence that some people had tried to take action. In 1934, a ranger named Henry Crow Dog, himself of Blackfeet descent, had submitted a formal report requesting that the cedar grove be declared off-limits to visitors. His report detailed 7 disappearances over a 20-year period and included maps showing the exact boundaries of what he called the affected area. Crow Dog's report was rejected by park administration, and he was quietly transferred to a different post. The grove remained open to the public, and the disappearances continued. I spent hours studying Crow Dog's maps, comparing them to current topographical surveys. His affected area corresponded almost exactly to the region where I'd been tracking unusual incidents. More importantly, his notes included detailed observations about the creature's behavior and limitations. According to Crow Dog, the entities were most active during certain lunar phases and weather conditions. They seemed to feed on emotional energy as well as physical presence, which explained why they targeted people who were psychologically vulnerable, the lost, the grieving, the desperate, and they were bound to their territory by some kind of symbiotic relationship with the ancient cedar trees. But the most important detail in Crow Dog's notes was a reference to the choir growing stronger. He'd observed that each new victim increased the creature's range and power. They weren't just consuming people, they were adding their voices to some kind of collective consciousness that became more persuasive and more dangerous with each feeding. This information gave me hope. If the creatures were bound to the grove and dependent on the trees, there might be a way to weaken or contain them. But first, I needed to understand the current extent of their influence. I began monitoring radio communications throughout the park, listening for any reports of unusual incidents. What I discovered was terrifying. The affected area was expanding. Over the past month, there had been reports of strange voices and disorienting echoes from locations up to 8 miles from the cedar grove. The creature's influence was growing, and it was only a matter of time before they claimed another victim. That victim turned out to be closer than I'd expected. 3 weeks after my encounter at the feeding ground, I received a radio call from a day hiker named Rebecca Walsh. She'd gotten separated from her group near Akokala Lake, about 6 miles from my station. She was scared, cold, and running low on water. "Can you see any landmarks?" I asked her over the radio. "I'm in a valley with really tall trees," she said. "Cedar trees, I think. There's a clearing in the middle." My blood went cold. She was in the grove. "Rebecca, listen to me very carefully. You need to leave that area immediately. Don't investigate any sounds you hear. Don't follow any voices. Just get out of there as fast as you can." "What? Why? What's wrong?" Before I could answer, her transmission cut to static. I tried calling her back, but got no response. I was already throwing gear into my pack when the radio crackled again. "Hello? Is anyone there?" It was Rebecca's voice, but there was something off about it. A slight delay, like she was repeating words she'd heard a moment before. "Rebecca, where are you?" "I'm hurt," the voice said. "I fell down and I think I broke my ankle. I'm in the clearing with the tall trees. Can you come help me?" But Rebecca had just told me she was fine except for being lost and low on water. She hadn't mentioned any injury. I was listening to something else wearing her voice. "Where exactly are you hurt?" I asked, testing my theory. "I'm hurt," the voice repeated, exactly the same tone and inflection. "I fell down and I think I broke my ankle." It was playing back her words like a recording, unable to improvise or respond to specific questions. The creature had Rebecca, and it was using her voice to try to lure me into the grove. I had two choices: call for backup and let the official search and rescue teams walk into the same trap that had claimed every other victim, or go in alone and try to extract Rebecca before the creatures could consume her completely. I chose the third option. I decided to end this. I loaded my pack with everything I thought I might need: flare gun, emergency flares, camp fuel, climbing rope, first aid kit, and my grandfather's old hunting knife. If Henry Crow Dog was right about the creatures being dependent on the trees, maybe I could find a way to sever that connection. The hike to the grove took 2 hours, and I heard Rebecca's voice calling for help the entire way. Sometimes it was her original plea for assistance, sometimes variations that sounded like responses to questions I wasn't asking. The creatures were trying to create a conversation, but they could only work with the sounds they'd captured. As I approached the grove, I heard something that made me stop cold. My own voice, calling Rebecca's name. They'd been listening to my radio transmissions, recording my voice just as they'd recorded hers. Soon they'd be able to imitate me perfectly, and the next person who came looking would hear both Rebecca and me calling for help. I circled the grove until I found what I was looking for: a game trail that led to the edge of the depression where the feeding ground was located. I could see movement in the canopy overhead, pale shapes flowing between the branches like living smoke. And there, in the center of the depression, was Rebecca. She was standing perfectly still, looking up at the trees with an expression of wonder on her face. She appeared unharmed, but there was something wrong with the way she was breathing. Too slow, too shallow, as if she was falling asleep on her feet. "Rebecca!" I called from the edge of the grove. She turned toward me, and I saw that her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible eye. When she spoke, her voice was layered with other sounds, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "Join us," she said. "It's peaceful here. We're all together now." The creatures had started the process of absorbing her, but it wasn't complete yet. If I could get her out of the grove quickly, there might still be time to save her. I pulled out my flare gun and fired directly into the canopy above Rebecca. The magnesium flare burst among the branches in an explosion of white light, and the creatures reacted immediately. They poured down from the trees like liquid shadow, flowing across the ground toward me in a wave of pale, writhing forms. But they stopped at the edge of the grove, unable or unwilling to leave the boundary of their territory. They clustered at the perimeter, reaching toward me with appendages that weren't quite arms, making that wet clicking sound that was their true voice. Rebecca was still standing in the center of the depression, but the flare seemed to have broken whatever hold they'd had on her. She looked around in confusion, then saw me and stumbled in my direction. "Run!" I shouted. "Don't look back, just run." She made it halfway to the edge before the creatures began their final gambit. Every voice they'd ever captured started calling at once, a chorus of the dead that rose from the grove like a physical force. I heard my parents, my grandparents, Coda, Marcus Chen, and dozens of others I didn't recognize. They promised everything I'd ever wanted, offered everything I'd ever lost, pleaded with me to join them in their eternal communion. The sound was overwhelming, but I forced myself to focus on Rebecca. She was close enough to reach now, and I grabbed her hand and pulled her out of the grove. The moment we crossed the boundary, the voices stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. Rebecca collapsed, unconscious but breathing normally. Her eyes had returned to their natural color, and her pulse was strong. I carried her to a safe distance from the grove, then radioed for medical evacuation. As we waited for the helicopter, I looked back at the cedar trees. The creatures were still there, clustered at the edge of their territory, watching us with alien intelligence. I'd saved Rebecca, but I hadn't solved the problem. They were still hungry, still growing stronger, still adding voices to their choir. But I'd learned something important. They could be fought. They had limitations, boundaries, weaknesses, and if Henry Crow Dog had been right about their dependence on the trees, maybe there was a way to break their hold on this place permanently. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Rebecca Walsh spent 3 days in the hospital under observation, with no memory of her time in the grove beyond entering the clearing and feeling incredibly peaceful. The doctors attributed her condition to mild hypothermia and dehydration, and she was released with instructions to avoid strenuous hiking for a few weeks. I visited her before she left town, hoping to learn more about what she'd experienced, but her description was frustratingly vague. She remembered the trees seeming to whisper to her, feeling like she belonged there, and a sense that she was part of something larger than herself. When I pressed for details, she became agitated and changed the subject. "I don't want to think about it," she said finally. "Whatever happened in there, it wasn't natural. I keep having dreams where I'm back in those trees and everyone I've ever loved is there with me. The dreams feel more real than being awake." That confirmed my suspicions about how the creatures operated. They didn't just mimic voices, they created psychological experiences so compelling that their victims actively wanted to stay. Rebecca had been lucky that my intervention broke their hold before the process was complete. Others hadn't been so fortunate. I returned to my research with new urgency. If the creature's influence was expanding and their choir was growing stronger with each victim, it was only a matter of time before they claimed someone else. I needed to find a way to stop them permanently. The answer came from an unexpected source, a journal hidden in the basement archives of the park's administrative building. It belonged to Henry Crow Dog, the ranger who tried to close the grove in 1934. His family had donated his personal papers to the park after his death in 1967, but they'd been misfiled and forgotten. Crow Dog's journal contained 40 years of observations about the creatures, written in a mixture of English and Blackfeet. I had to find a tribal historian to help translate some passages, but what I learned changed everything. According to Crow Dog, the creatures weren't native to this place. They were parasites that had arrived sometime in the late 1800s, drawn by the spiritual energy that the Blackfeet had concentrated in the grove through generations of ritual use. The ancient cedars had been sacred trees, places where the tribe communicated with their ancestors. The creatures had corrupted this connection, feeding on the spiritual energy and using it to power their own twisted form of consciousness. But the most important discovery was Crow Dog's description of a ritual the Blackfeet had used to cleanse corrupted spiritual sites. It involved severing the connection between the parasites and their host environment through a combination of fire, sacred smoke, and what he called the returning of voices. The journal included detailed instructions for the ritual, along with warnings about the dangers involved. According to Crow Dog, anyone attempting the cleansing would become the focus of the creature's full attention. They would use every voice in their choir to try to stop the ritual, and if they succeeded, the person performing it would become their most powerful victim yet. I spent a week gathering the materials Crow Dog had specified: sage from a specific valley, cedar bark from trees that had never been touched by the parasites, and most crucially, recordings of the creature's stolen voices. This last requirement had puzzled me until I realized what Crow Dog meant by returning of voices. I needed to play back the creature's mimicry to break their hold on the sounds they'd stolen. I'd been recording the voices I heard during my patrols, and I had hours of audio captured during my encounters with the creatures. If Crow Dog was right, playing these recordings back at the Grove would force the creatures to release their hold on the stolen voices, weakening their power and breaking their connection to the trees. The ritual had to be performed during the new moon, when the creature's influence was at its weakest. I had 3 days to prepare. On the night of the new moon, I hiked to the Grove carrying a portable speaker, Crow Dog's ritual materials, and enough fuel to burn the entire grove if necessary. The forest was darker than I'd ever seen it, with cloud cover blocking even the stars. I used my flashlight sparingly, relying mostly on my knowledge of the trails to guide me. The grove was silent when I arrived, but I could sense the creatures watching from the canopy. They knew I was coming. I'd made no attempt to hide my approach. Let them know. Let them prepare. It wouldn't matter. I set up the speaker at the edge of the grove and began the ritual exactly as Crow Dog had described. First, I lit a bundle of sage and walked the perimeter of the grove, letting the smoke drift between the trees. The creatures reacted immediately, flowing down from the canopy in agitation, but they still couldn't cross the boundary. Next, I scattered cedar bark in a pattern around the feeding ground, forming what Crow Dog had called the Circle of Return. The creatures were making their clicking sounds now, a chattering that rose in pitch and intensity as they sensed what I was doing. Finally, I activated the speaker and began playing back the recorded voices. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Every creature in the grove began screaming, not with stolen human voices, but with their true sound, a wet shrieking that seemed to come from multiple mouths at once. It poured across the ground toward me in a wave of pale flesh and impossible limbs, but when they reached the circle of cedar bark, they recoiled as if burned. The voices coming from the speaker began to change. What had been perfect mimicry started to distort, becoming layered with the creature's real sounds. I could hear Marcus Chen's voice separating from the clicking underneath it, becoming clearer and more distinct. Then Coda's voice, then dozens of others I didn't recognize. The creatures were losing their hold on the stolen sounds, but they weren't giving up without a fight. As each voice separated from their collective, they launched it back at me with desperate intensity. I heard every person I'd ever lost pleading with me to stop the ritual. My parents begged me to join them. Coda promised to explain everything if I would just cross the circle and embrace him. The psychological assault was overwhelming. Part of me wanted nothing more than to step into the grove and reunite with everyone I'd loved and lost. But I forced myself to remember Rebecca's black eyes, the neat piles of belongings in the feeding ground, the decades of victims who'd followed similar promises into oblivion. The ritual was working. With each freed voice, the creatures became more desperate, more frantic. They began throwing themselves against the circle with increasing violence, their forms becoming less cohesive as their power weakened. Some of them were actually dissolving, unable to maintain their shape without the stolen energy that had sustained them. Then I heard something that nearly broke my resolve. Coda's voice, but different from before. Clearer, more real. "Ayana," he said, and this time there was no clicking underneath it, no artificial delay. "Thank you. I can see the path now. I can go home." One by one, the freed voices spoke their final words. Some thanked me, others simply said goodbye. A few warned me about other places where similar creatures might be feeding, but all of them sounded peaceful, relieved, finally free to move on to whatever came next. As the last voice faded, the creatures let out a collective shriek that shattered the windows on my speaker. Then they began to collapse inward, their forms dissolving into puddles of pale liquid that soaked into the earth. Within minutes, there was nothing left of them but strange stains on the forest floor. The ancient cedars themselves began to change. The carved patterns in their bark faded and disappeared. Their leaves, which had always seemed too green and vibrant for the environment, dulled to normal colors. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the grove for over a century lifted like fog in sunlight. I completed the ritual by lighting a small fire in the center of the feeding ground and burning the remaining cedar bark. According to Crowdog's instructions, this would purify the soil and prevent any remnant of the creatures from taking root again. As the fire burned, I scattered the ashes of the personal belongings I'd found in the feeding ground, the final remains of the creatures' victims. They deserved a proper ending, not eternal servitude to parasitic entities that wore their voices like masks. By dawn, it was over. The grove looked like an ordinary patch of forest, beautiful but no longer threatening. Birds were singing in the canopy for the first time since I'd started working in the area. The air smelled clean and fresh, without the underlying corruption that had tainted it before. I hiked back to my cabin as the sun rose, exhausted but satisfied. I'd done what I came here to do. I'd found out what happened to Coda, and I'd made sure it wouldn't happen to anyone else. The official report I filed described the grove as geologically unstable and recommended that it be closed to public access. Park administration accepted my recommendation without question. They were more concerned about liability than they were about losing access to a remote section of wilderness that few people visited anyway. I stayed on as a ranger for another 6 months, making sure the grove remained quiet and that no new incidents occurred in the surrounding area. During that time, I met with several tribal elders and returned copies of Henry Crowdog's journal to his family. They weren't surprised that the hungry place had finally been cleansed. They'd been waiting for someone to complete Crowdog's work for almost 90 years. When I finally left Glacier National Park, I took with me the knowledge that there are things in the wilderness that science doesn't understand, and that some places hold dangers that can only be fought with wisdom older than our civilization. I also carried the voices of everyone who'd thanked me in those final moments, proof that some forms of rescue can reach across the boundary between life and death. I still work as a park ranger, though in different locations now. And sometimes when I'm alone in the deep woods, I listen carefully to the sounds around me, because I know that what I found in Glacier's shadow wasn't unique. There are other hungry places, other parasites wearing familiar voices, other choirs of the lost waiting for someone to set them free. The wilderness keeps its secrets, but some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and some voices are too precious to let fade into the darkness without a fight. In the end, that's what being a ranger really means. Standing guard not just against the natural dangers of the wild, but against the unnatural ones that hide in places where the maps end and the real world begins.